Hello, fellow Sapiens. A quiet welcome to Midnight Sapien. Whether you're walking under dim city lights, drifting towards sleep beside an open window, or filling the silence between long miles on a dark road, this space is for you, because tonight we're stepping into the story of how prehistoric Americans survived deadly heat without a drop of water to spare. This is reflective storytelling for minds that prefer to listen slowly. This is the untold struggle of survival through a 10,000-year drought, written in the language of the absence of water. But this isn't the simple tale of thirst and desperation. It's a story of innovation, memory, and a desert that became both teacher and trial. Oh, and if you're someone who enjoys long-form science and thoughtful history, look just below this video. You'll see a little button that says subscribe. Give it a tap if you'd like. You can always change your mind. And there's a bell next to it that lets you know when new stories arrive. Subscribing helps this small channel survive. Without your support, we truly can't keep making these videos. By the way, where are you listening from? What time is it for you right now? If you feel like sharing, drop a note in the comments. It's a quiet reminder that we're all here together. And if you're ready to fall asleep, please feel free. Timestamps are in the description. Now we begin, with a footprint pressed into dry earth. Long before the desert cracked beneath 130 degrees of sun, long before the salt beds gleamed like mirages across the horizon, there were feet, bare, cautious, human, stepping into what would one day become the most forbidding landscapes on Earth. This is not a story about catastrophe, though catastrophe lingers in the margins. It is a story of arrival, of the first people who came to a land that had not yet revealed its trials, who walked with curiosity and instinct into a future no one could foresee, who built the first quiet empires of survival, not in cities, but in memory, in motion, and in the exquisite attention to a world that would soon begin to vanish. What must it have felt like to walk into that land and not yet know its thirst? At the tail end of the last ice age, the Earth exhaled. The great glaciers that had choked the northern continents began their slow retreat. As they pulled back, they revealed a narrow corridor, ice to either side, wind howling down its length, a passage between the towering Laurentide and Cordilleran ice sheets. It was not an easy road. It was not warm, but it was open, and it led south. South into the heart of a continent still in transformation. Here, between 30,000 and 15,000 years ago, small bands of humans moved like shadows along the edges of meltwater and stone. Some came this inland way, their footprints pressed into soft sediment now buried beneath millennia of time. Others arrived along the western coast, paddling the frigid, tumultuous margins of a continent still girded by ice. These were not separate peoples. They were expressions of the same longing, to find something more habitable than the place behind them, to follow game, to follow warmth, to follow the land itself as it unfolded, uncertain and raw beneath their feet. What map did they carry when there were no lines yet drawn? They brought few tools but deep knowledge. Fire starters, stone blades, fibres twisted into rope and net. But perhaps more importantly, they brought attention, a way of reading the land not as scenery but as story. Every broken branch, every bird call, every scent in the air told them something. They listened, they adjusted. They survived not by force, but by noticing. And the land they walked into was not yet a furnace. It was a basin filled with water. Lakes shimmered in low valleys. Rivers meandered through grasslands where now there is only dust. Great inland seas stretched across what we now call Nevada and Utah and eastern California. Mammoths drank beside giant sloths and camelids. The ground was wet beneath the morning sun. The air held the softness of evaporating dew. Fish moved in the shallows. Waterfowl nested in dense reed beds that stretched like green cathedrals toward the sky. How could anyone have guessed what was coming? They built temporary camps beside the shores of Pleistocene giants, Lake Bonneville, Lake Lahontan, Lake Manly. Bodies of water so vast they mirrored the clouds and reflected the passage of seasons. These were not merely sources of hydration. They were entire ecosystems, fish for food, reeds for weaving, clay for shaping. They were worlds unto themselves, and the people, these early sapiens, treated them with reverence earned through necessity. But already something was beginning to shift. The warmth that had once been a gentle invitation became a lingering weight in the air. The rains, once predictable, began to hesitate. Lake margins crept inward. The once verdant wetlands took on the smell of rot and drying mud. It did not happen quickly. It happened like erosion, steady, insistent, and nearly invisible until it was undeniable. What was once abundance became memory. What was once a world of water began to withdraw. What happens when a people awaken to a world already leaving them behind? In the sediment cores drawn from these vanished lakes, we see it now. Pollen records change. The green-loving grasses give way to plants more suited for drought. Dust layers thicken between bands of clay. Bones of fish grow rarer in the archaeological layers. There is silence in the absence of water, silence in the disappearance of frogs, silence in the dry cracking of once wet places. The land was beginning to forget its lushness, and the people had to remember something else. Yet they did not flee, not all of them. Instead they lingered, adapted, reoriented. The game moved differently now. The reeds that once grew tall grew sparse, but those who watched closely still knew where to gather them. The springs had not yet vanished. The mornings were still cool, the evenings still long. There was still time. But time in prehistory is a strange thing. It does not warn. It does not shout. It shifts quietly beneath your feet, and only the most attuned will feel it. And these first desert walkers, they were attuned. They saw the footprints of water where no liquid remained. They tracked birds that flew low, their bodies leading the way to hidden marshes not yet dry. They watched the colour of the grass and knew when it was no longer safe to rest nearby. They dug shallow basins near where the soil felt cold and waited. They touched the skin of the earth the way one might feel a sleeping animal's breath. Is this what it means to belong to a place? To feel its sorrow before its loss becomes visible? As the last ice age exhaled its final breath, the earth tilted subtly toward a new climate regime. Orbital changes whispered their commands to glaciers and wind currents, and the great atmospheric engines shifted their gears. The jet stream wandered, monsoon patterns weakened, and with that the southwest began to dry, slowly, relentlessly. But to the early peoples, these were not abstract climatological processes. These were the textures of their days, a smaller catch of fish, a fire that burned more quickly through dry grass, a child's mouth thirsting sooner in the morning, signs, clues. They did not know of ice sheets or orbital wobble, but they knew what the sky was telling them. They read its silence, so they kept walking, not in escape, but in rhythm, following the land, not fleeing it, adjusting without resistance, trusting in movement as memory and in memory as map. Across what is now Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and parts of Nevada, the people moved like wind-blown seeds, light, temporary, deliberate. They did not build in stone, they built in patterns, in cycles, in the repeated return to places that still remembered water. And some of those places, ephemeral lakes, slow-trickling springs, still held on, though just barely. What do you hold on to when everything begins to let go? To look at the southwest today, its cracked soil, its bleached pliers, its sweeping salt flats, is to misunderstand its past. It was never simply barren. It was never empty. This land was once layered in green. Herds once thundered here. Waters once lapped gently at sandy shores. And humans once lived in harmony with this abundance, not in dominance, but in cohabitation. In the Middle Pleistocene, the Great Basin was a sanctuary. Isolated and ringed by mountains, it caught the flow of glacial melt and held it like a secret. Massive pluvial lakes, formed by precipitation and runoff rather than glacier scouring, pooled between volcanic ridges and faulted hills. Lake Bonneville was nearly as large as modern Lake Michigan. Lake Lahontan stretched across western Nevada like a giant's forgotten basin. These were inland seas, and they shaped not just the topography, but the imagination of those who wandered their edges. What dreams are born beside a body of water that has no end? The edges of these lakes became more than just boundaries. They were liminal zones, places where humans could harvest fish, trap birds, gather seeds, places where children could play, elders could tell stories, and silence could fall like mist across the reeds. Archaeological sites like Hoggup Cave, Lovelock Cave, and Danger Cave offer glimpses of these early lake-bound lives. Baskets woven from tule reeds, stone points chipped with exquisite precision, coprolites, ancient human feces, preserved so well that they still carry the DNA of what was eaten. There is intimacy in what is left behind. These people did not write their history. They encoded it in what they touched, in how they moved, in what they carried and what they chose to leave behind. We reconstruct their lives not from monuments, but from refuse, from shadows, from the small, silent evidence of human persistence. And in these clues, we see that they were not primitive. They were specialists. They understood seasonality, migration, edible flora. They knew the difference between survival and thriving, and they knew change. Because even in the fullness of these early days, even when the lakes were deep and the land was forgiving, there were hints. Not omens exactly, just subtle asymmetries. One season slightly drier, a waterline that did not return, a species of fish less plentiful than before. And though they had no satellites, no data models, they understood patterns, and they remembered them. What is memory, if not the capacity to survive what hasn't happened yet? The memory of the land itself began to change, folding new truths into its soil. Mudflats hardened into clay pans, birds nested farther north. The lake edges where children once dipped their toes became places where dust gathered in spirals. Still, the people stayed. Not out of denial, but out of relationship. Their knowledge was not based on resistance, but on reading. Reading wind, cloud, tracks, and silence. And the silence was growing. And in the silence, something new began to rise. Resilience. Resilience is not a shield. It is a kind of conversation, an ongoing negotiation with difficulty. These early inhabitants of the Southwest were not waiting for collapse. They were adapting in real time, learning not just to follow water but to anticipate its moods. If a spring failed, they knew another might bloom 50 miles away after a snowmelt unseen in the higher peaks. If a lake receded, they read the exposed clay for signs of what had been buried. Bulbs, roots, stone tools once lost to the silt. How do you navigate a world that is rearranging itself beneath your feet? They lighten their loads. They sharpen their senses. They change their expectations of the land, not with despair, but with precision. There is an elegance to this kind of survival. A choreography of temporary camps, foraged meals, shared stories, and perhaps most significantly, they began to encode the land's fluctuations into their oral traditions, in songs, in place names, in the cyclical repetition of journeys taken not in haste but with reverence. And still, the heat pressed closer. Each generation moved slightly differently than the one before. Routes once safe during midsummer now had to be taken in early spring. The night stretched out with less moisture in the air, and even the stars, watched closely, named lovingly, seemed to shimmer with a dryness that hadn't been there before. But the people continued. Why abandon a place simply because it dares to change? In some regions, evidence of their presence fades, not because they vanished, but because they moved with such grace that the earth barely noticed their passing. In other regions, they left more behind. Fire pits ringed with stones blackened by countless meals, caches of obsidian tools too precise to be random, bones of jackrabbit and pronghorn cleaned with skillful hands. These remnants speak not of desperation, but of adjustment. It was not that they were unaware of the coming trials, it was that they met them with curiosity. And curiosity in the ancient world was as vital as water. For to live in a changing world, one must be willing to ask questions without immediate answers. One must notice the subtle change in the way dust settles. One must follow the sound of silence and recognize when it grows too loud. One must look at the sun not as enemy, but as messenger. And the sun was indeed sending messages, not in language, but in shadow, in the way it lingered longer each year, hovering just a little higher, burning just a little sharper into the ground, in the hardening of soil once soft, in the way skin dried faster, and streams evaporated quicker, and the plants once supple and green grew brittle at the edges. The sun was becoming more than a celestial guide. It was becoming a force to be reckoned with, a sculptor, reshaping the future of an entire continent. How do you prepare for a fire you cannot see, only feel? The transition from lush Pleistocene wetlands to the desiccated plateaus of the early Holocene was not a single event. It was a quiet unravelling, a slow drift towards severity. It unfolded not across years or even generations, but over millennia, long enough for the human mind to adapt, but not so slow as to go unnoticed. The shift can be traced now in the isotopic signatures locked in stalagmites, in the deep cores of ancient lake beds, in the chemistry of a desert varnish forming on sun-blasted rock. But for those early humans, there were no charts or models. There was only the day-to-day feel of the wind, the colour of the sky, the changing song of birds, and still they remained. To remain in a land withdrawing its gifts is not an act of defiance. It is an act of reverence. They did not stay to conquer. They stayed to listen, to learn the new language of the place. When the big lakes shrank, they turned their eyes to the smaller ones. When the reed beds died off, they found new ways to bind fibre. When the heat became unbearable by midday, they became creatures of dawn and dusk. They did not build walls against the sun. They moved with it. And it is this grace, this patience, this willingness to evolve in lockstep with an indifferent world, that defines the brilliance of those first desert dwellers, not in what they resisted, but in how they yielded. Not in what they feared, but in what they observed. The beginnings of human presence in the American Southwest were not marked by dominance, but by awe. What if survival is not about power, but about understanding? In time, the Great Lakes would vanish entirely. The wetlands would collapse into salt pans. The forest would pull back into cooler altitudes. The megafauna would disappear, and new species would rise, but the people would remain. Thinner in number, lighter in footprint, deeper in knowing. They would carry forward the memory of water even when only dust remained. They would trace old lake beds not as ruins, but as sacred pathways. They would sing the names of rivers long dry. And though their footprints would fade, pressed once into wet clay, now hardened into silence, their presence would echo on. Because they were not the first to walk through fire, they were the first to understand that fire could be walked through. But even fire was not the true threat, not yet, not then. The fire would come later. What came first was something quieter, something more profound, a slow and irreversible forgetting. Not of culture or of knowledge, but of moisture. The land was beginning to thirst, and thirst, when it arrives slowly, does not feel like crisis. It feels like delay, like a promise that is no longer kept. What does it mean when a place begins to forget the feeling of rain? 12,900 years ago, the world was briefly plunged back into cold. The Younger Dryas, it's called, a sudden return of glacial chill, like the earth breathing in sharply before the warmth came rushing back in. But that chill ended just as suddenly, and the breath was exhaled with force. Temperatures surged, ice collapsed, sea levels rose. The earth warmed faster than at any point in the previous 100,000 years. The glacial heart of the continent beat slower, then stopped, and the heat began to radiate outward. And in the southwest, the transformation was relentless. Lakes that had stretched for miles began to shrink. The waterline receded by feet each year, leaving behind cracked earth and forgotten bones. Rivers became erratic, pulsing only with spring snowmelt, and disappearing into silence by midsummer. Springs that had whispered for centuries fell mute. Vegetation withered, and still the sun grew bolder, more confident in its command. What happens when a body loses its memory of water? It wasn't only the land that struggled to remember. The megafauna, those magnificent slow-moving architects of prehistoric life, began to lose their way. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, camelids, horses, saber-toothed cats, all began to drift, their migrations no longer circular but panicked. They moved southward, lower, chasing shade, chasing green, chasing the illusion of permanence. But the earth no longer offered permanence. Across what would become the American Southwest, the last of the mammoths passed through canyons that now bake under midday sun. Their tusks scraped bark from trees that no longer grow there. Their footprints were pressed into soils that are now dust. Their lives, once rooted in ecological rhythm, unravelled in a spiral of hunger and heat. And all around them, humans watched. What must it have felt like? To witness the great ones vanish. To stand at the edge of a drying lake, watching an animal bigger than a house, older than a myth, stumble toward the horizon. To see their bones left behind, not as relics, but as recent neighbours who did not survive the conversation. The extinction of the megafauna was not a distant tragedy. It was a collapse heard by those still trying to live. And in that collapse, a new kind of adaptation began. Campfires burned beside lake beds that no longer reached their former shores, their flames flickering against walls of cracked sediment where reeds once swayed in the wind. The air smelled not of blooming vegetation, but of cooling ash, damp earth, and something else. Absence. It was here, in these liminal spaces between water and wasteland, that humans made their first quiet agreements with a dying world. They did not leave, they listened. What kind of courage does it take to stay when the world no longer sustains you in the way it once did? Those early people did not have the luxury of disbelief. Their survival depended on noticing what others might ignore. They watched as trails carved by mammoths turned into dust corridors walked now only by lean, thirsty deer. They traced the shrinking edges of lakes with their fingertips, noting how the mineral crusts along the shoreline hardened earlier each year. They listened to the frog songs diminish, to the cries of birds fade as they migrated elsewhere. They were, in every sense, bearing witness to a great retreat. And yet, even amidst loss, they built fire. A fire near a lake bed was not just warmth, it was recalibration. Flames lit the drying reeds, revealing where water still pooled beneath the cracked surface. Smoke curled into the night sky, carrying messages to neighbouring bands. Beneath the stars, decisions were made. Which springs still held water? Which valleys still carried dew at dawn? Which paths would no longer be safe when the sun reached its zenith? What is adaptation if not the art of asking the land new questions? The end of the Younger Dryas did more than bring warmth. It summoned instability. Rainfall became erratic. Glacial meltwater no longer fed rivers as before. Wind patterns shifted, carving dunes into places where children once gathered cattail roots. Even the mountains, those ancient sentinels, felt the change. Snowpacks thinned, meltwater streams emerged earlier, ran faster, and dried sooner. The desert was not yet fully born, but its heartbeat had begun. And with each degree of warming, the giants fell. The disappearance of the megafauna was not just ecological, it was personal. The mammoths that once provided meat, hides, sinew, bone, gone. The ancient camelids that roamed in quiet herds across grasslands, gone. The dire wolves and saber-toothed cats that shadowed them, gone. The land was losing its titans, and in their absence came silence, followed by hunger. How do you feed a family when the animals you depended on no longer walk the earth? The people turned to smaller lives. Jackrabbits, pronghorn, birds, lizards, seeds, roots, bulbs. Hunting spears were sharpened differently. Baskets were woven tighter to carry whatever remained. These were not signs of failure. They were signs of resilience. The world had rewritten its rules, and they, instead of resisting, chose to learn a new language. Still, the fires at night remained. Circles of warmth against an encroaching dark. Sparks rising against a sky that felt deeper, larger, emptier. Flames reflecting in the eyes of those who understood that the world they had inherited was gone, and yet still they chose to remain in it. How does a people learn to live in a place that is learning to forget water? They begin by changing the way they listen, not to words but to landscapes. They crouch at the base of desert arroyos and press their palms to the ground, not in prayer but in patience. They notice which insects disappear and which arrive. They follow the winds not by direction but by scent. Dry sage, warm dust, the trace of distant rain that may never fall. In this new age they do not conquer the land, they decipher it. And in that deciphering, new patterns emerge. The camps shift closer to springs that still remember the glacial past, where meltwater from higher elevations whispers through stone even in drought. Hearths are placed strategically, not just for warmth, but for visibility. Watchfires for those returning, signals to the horizon. Food is no longer hunted with certainty but gathered with care. Prickly pear, mesquite pods, agave hearts. These are not replacements. They are revelations. The desert, once seen as lacking, begins to reveal its hidden logic. Isn't that what survival is? Not resisting change, but discovering its invitation. The bones of the megafauna lie silent now beneath the sand. Their absence has changed everything. With their grazing gone, grasses behave differently. With their dung no longer nourishing the soil, the desert encroaches faster. The ecological balance that once held firm has tipped, and those left behind must live within the aftermath. But even in the aftermath, fire still speaks. Night after night, early humans gather around the flame, not just for heat, but for orientation. Fire marks the centre, the known, the space where stories can still be told. And around that centre, everything else is renegotiated. The stars seem brighter in a drier sky. The wind moves differently across a cooling basin, and the sounds, the lack of them, become their own kind of story. How do you tell a story that is still being erased as it unfolds? They tell it in movements, in seasonal returns to places now visited with more caution, in teaching the young how to walk in silence, how to carry water in tightly woven pouches, how to know the difference between a dry spring and a sleeping one. The art of the living has become the art of interpreting nuance, of feeling the land shift and answering not with panic but with elegance. Even the tools change. Spear points grow smaller, optimized for smaller game. Grinding stones become more central, used now for seeds rather than meat. The implements of survival grow quieter, more intimate, more precise. This is not regression. This is refinement. What happens when necessity sharpens not just the blade, but the mind behind it? The ones who remain are no longer merely surviving. They are becoming the architects of a new kind of relationship, with a land that no longer gives freely, but still, in its own way, gives. They no longer expect the past to return. Instead, they shape a present that listens forward. A present where the rules of the world are written not in stone, but in sand, and every gust of wind rewrites them. Where permanence is no longer the measure of safety, where impermanence itself becomes a form of stability, because it is the only constant they can trust. In this strange new equilibrium, time moves not in a straight line, but in ripples. Every drought remembers a flood. Every desert trail carries the ghost of a riverbed. Can you live in a land by remembering what it once was, even when it no longer is? This remembering is not nostalgic. It is tactical. The people memorize the old shorelines of the receding lakes, not as sentimental landmarks, but as cues for subterranean moisture. They dig shallow test pits near the edges where cattails once grew, hoping to find even a darkening of earth. And when they do, they plant nothing, but they rest there, they drink there, they learn. These are not gardens, these are whispers, the beginnings of desert literacy. In the remains of their camps, archaeologists have found the traces of these first adaptations. Stone-lined hearths carefully situated to shelter fire from the relentless wind. Charcoal fragments nestled within layers of ancient clay. Signatures of presence, of insistence, of continued return. Nearby, shells from coastal mollusks traded across vast inland distances suggest networks of connection that carried not just goods, but information. When the land grew quiet, the people grew connected, and through those connections, knowledge moved. One group's vanished spring became another's remembered story. One family's failed migration became a caution woven into song. In a world where maps could not be drawn, songs became the atlas. Spoken lines passed from elder to child became rivers of memory, carrying directions to where water still lingered, where shade could be found, where the wind would not kill. Is it possible that survival is not an individual act, but a collective remembering? What began as reaction was becoming resilience. Even in the heart of drying valleys, humans found ways to endure without illusion. They no longer waited for the world to return to what it had been. They began instead to shape themselves to what it was becoming. The very idea of home transformed. Not a single location, but a range of possibilities. Not a structure of permanence, but a constellation of places visited in rhythm with the seasons and the sun. This rhythm was more than just movement. It was reverence. Each journey between water sources became a ceremonial act. Each pause at a shaded canyon mouth, a moment of gratitude. Each night beneath a sky stripped of clouds became a meditation on smallness and on the vast, indifferent beauty of the earth. And in that beauty they found space, not to conquer, not to reclaim, but to belong. What does it mean to belong to a place that refuses to belong to you? It means learning to walk without leaving scars, to gather without taking more than the land can offer, to speak in tones low enough that the wind does not carry your voice away. In a place where rivers once ran and now vanish before noon, belonging is not ownership. It is participation. It is the humility to be small within something vast. It is the patience to be temporary within something eternal. And so they adapted, not through control, but through surrender. They surrendered to the long arc of heat, to the knowledge that water was no longer a certainty, to the quiet fact that the giants were gone, and the world had grown more intricate in their absence. In that surrender they became not weaker, but wiser. No longer trackers of megafauna, they became readers of microclimates. No longer hunters of giants, they became stewards of tiny clues, shadow, soil, scent. And all the while the earth kept warming. We now know through ice cores and lake bed sediments just how sharp this warming was. The transition out of the Younger Dryas marked a global pivot, one that accelerated desertification across regions unprepared for dryness. The American Southwest began its long journey toward aridity, driven not by fire alone, but by the slow reconfiguration of atmosphere and ocean. The jet stream faltered, precipitation patterns shifted, and humans, just as they always had, remained within the shifting lines listening. What do you do when the map changes while you're still walking it? They redrew the map in their minds, in their bodies, in the stories they passed around the fire. Fire. Always fire. Its role transformed from warmth to memory, from defence to centre. The hearth became the anchor in a sea of uncertainty. It held together families, tribes, stories, and time itself. And beside those fires, people spoke of the old world, the world of mammoths and marshes and ice-fed lakes. Not as a lost paradise, but as a lesson. They did not mourn the past as much as they studied it, carved it into rhythm, and let it shape their decisions. Even as they stared into a sky that held no promise of rain, they remembered that it once had, and from that remembering they found the strength to wait, or to move, or to adapt again. Because adaptation was not a single act, it was a posture. To adapt was not to change once and be finished. It was to become change itself, to live in such a way that every gesture acknowledged impermanence, to rest lightly in a place that might vanish, to cherish what could not be held. These early people became fluid, not like water, but like those who remember water, and so the land continued to thirst. But it was no longer thirsting alone. It was watched, understood, endured. By a people who had learned that to stay in a vanishing world one must become the kind of creature who leaves no trail, and who needs none to find their way home. But home was becoming harder to name. Harder to define. The landmarks once marked by water were turning into illusions, and the wind, once a companion, now arrived dry and sharp, bearing not scent, but salt. The great silence had begun. Not a silence of stillness, but a silence of subtraction. Rivers no longer flowing, reeds no longer rustling, lakes no longer calling out to the sky in ripples and reflection. What does it sound like when a continent begins to forget how to speak in water? This silence was not absence, it was presence in a new form, a gleaming, blinding, crystalline presence. Across the heart of what we now call the Great Basin, the ancient lakes that once nourished entire ecosystems had begun to collapse inward, evaporating into skeletal remains. Lake Bonneville, once stretching nearly 20,000 square miles, retreated into what would eventually become the Great Salt Lake, a memory of water more than a body of it. Lake Lahontan in Nevada, once deep and sprawling, splintered into a series of drying basins and dust plains. Lake Manly, at the base of what would one day be Death Valley, left only a salted imprint of its former self. These were not lakes anymore. They were mirrors of extinction. What once shimmered now crusted. Sodium carbonate and gypsum painted the ground in white scabs, drawing lines around where life had once gathered. These salt flats reflected the sky with unnerving clarity. Too perfect, too still. They offered no invitation. They offered only warning. And yet people still crossed them. Why would anyone walk across a floor made of forgotten oceans? Because the wind had changed and the water could no longer guide them. And so they learned to follow something else. They listened not to streams but to the spaces between. The gaps in the hills where the wind funneled. The corridors where dust lifted suddenly and ran ahead like scouts. The sand dunes began to speak in contour. Ripples told them what direction the storms had come from. Cracked ground whispered of old water, long gone but once recent. The desert was being born, grain by grain. It did not arrive as a dramatic shift. It arrived as a steady sculpting. The wind, unconcerned with human memory, began to take hold of the land. Not to destroy it, but to remake it. Hills of sand slowly crept across the basins like sleeping animals changing position. The air itself grew lighter but sharper. It no longer carried the softness of humidity. It carried information in its dryness. And those who survived were not the ones who resisted. They were the ones who learned to read the wind as others once read water, who knew that movement was not an error, but an answer, who began to carve their journeys not onto stone but into memory. Because in this new world, it was not the strongest who endured. It was the most attuned to the scrape of air over cracked lake bed, to the subtle shift in the direction of dust plumes, to the fine music of sand sliding over itself in the dark. In this new world, silence was no longer the absence of life. It was the shape life took in the absence of abundance. And everywhere, the land was rewriting its story in salt. What does it mean to trace a path through a place that refuses to hold your footprints? Beneath the sun, the salt flats seemed eternal, but they were not. They were ephemeral monuments to retreating water. The thick crusts that glittered beneath the midday heat concealed stories of deep time, layers of sediment, shells, pollen grains, chemical ghosts of ancient floods. The surface held still, but the past lay buried just beneath, mineralized and waiting. Humans did not need to understand these records scientifically. They understood them experientially. They knew that here, once, there had been plenty, and that now there was only reflection. In the wind's path, new forms began to rise. The birth of deserts is not an explosion. It is a persuasion, a slow, insistent asking of the land to yield. And across what would become the Mojave and the Sonoran deserts, the land yielded. Wind carved valleys into vast bowls of silence. Rock fractured, exposed and bleached by years of relentless sun. Sand, born from the grinding down of ancient mountains, became mobile, rising in graceful, brutal waves. Death Valley began as a depression, a sunken wound in the earth's crust. But it was the wind that turned it into something mythic. Here, heat and aridity were not simply environmental conditions, they were sculptors. The air grew thinner, the days grew longer. Rain fell less and less. And when it did come, it ran too fast to stay, dragging sediment with it, deepening the wounds. And still, the people followed. They did not run from the salt or the sand. They folded it into their sense of direction. They watched the angle of sun at different hours and used it to chart invisible lines. They placed stone markers not to define territory, but to remember paths. Paths across a terrain that did not want to be remembered, that erased its own history daily. Why draw maps on paper when the world is already erasing ink from skin? Instead, they carved the roots into themselves, into story, into song. The body became the compass. The memory became the guide. Places were not known by coordinates, but by feelings. The shape of a valley's wind, the taste of dust near a certain spring, the way shadows stretched at dusk across a canyon floor. These were not just environmental cues, they were emotional waypoints, and in the absence of water, wind became the teacher. The wind did not stay, it did not nourish, but it revealed. It moved the veil, It pointed, however briefly, toward possibility. And for those who could interpret it, it became more reliable than any river. It became the axis of survival, not because it offered comfort, but because it offered direction. It was merciless, yes, but it was honest. Unlike the vanishing waters that once promised sustenance and then receded without warning, the wind made no such illusions. It carved, it scoured, it spoke in a steady tongue, and those who learned to listen found themselves not wandering but guided. How do you find a way through a land that keeps shifting beneath you? The nomads of this age did not walk in straight lines. They moved in arcs and spirals shaped by the pulse of heat and the breathing of wind. Their roots curled around dune fields, skirted the edges of pliers that could swallow a person whole when wet, and ascended into canyons where shadows held coolness just long enough for life to catch its breath. These paths were not marked on hides or etched into rock. They were encoded in muscle memory, in lullabies whispered to children by firelight, in the repeated return to places that never stayed the same. This was not wandering, it was precision. Nomadism was not a lack of destination. It was a commitment to motion as a sacred act. The people who moved across the evaporated bones of Lake Lahontan or the searing openness of Death Valley were not lost. They were in dialogue. They knew when to travel by starlight, when to rest behind a sandstone bluff, when the dust storms arrived with the full moon's pull. This was not guesswork. It was inherited knowledge, cultivated not in books, but in generations of exposed skin and focused eyes. Where does memory go when the world erases its landmarks? Into rhythm, into ritual. The act of walking became a liturgy. The pause at midday, the stacking of rocks to mark a pass, the way hands cupped around the face to listen for echoes in the canyons, these were all forms of remembering. And what they remembered most was where not to go, which dry wells never revived, which valleys turned into ovens by mid-afternoon, which paths disappeared after the wind changed direction. Their lives were stories told in motion, and in this story, the wind had a character of its own. It came from the west, rising off the dry Pacific basin, warm and dry. It funneled through mountain passes, pushed clouds away, left behind silence. But it also revealed patterns, how the sand piled up along ridgelines, how the creosote bushes leaned, how the bones of jackrabbits clustered along windbreaks. For those who were still, who waited, the wind offered clarity. What happens when stillness becomes the truest form of movement? It is in this paradox that they thrived. They did not build cities. They did not farm. They became migratory architects of survival. They followed routes of least resistance, not because they were easy, but because they were known. Known not by sight, but by feeling. Not by maps, but by memory braided tightly into the human body, into feet that could trace old steps across dunes that looked like every other. This was the age of learning to read without eyes. To read with the soles of your feet, with the dryness of your lips, with the angle of your shadow on a salt-slick floor. To read with patience. Because patience was no longer a virtue, it was a requirement. In the land of salt winds, those who hurried perished. Those who waited endured. The landscape had no tolerance for haste. It offered no second chances. You listened once, or you were erased. What kind of wisdom emerges from a world that punishes impatience? The wind carried not only sand, but memory. The people learned to track its scent. Smoke from distant fires, the perfume of creosote, the metallic tang of coming storms that never quite arrived. Each breeze told a different story. If you listened carefully, you could tell whether the valley ahead had life or only illusion. Mirage and truth walked side by side here. Only the discerning could separate them. In the basins where water once gathered, now only shimmering illusions hovered above the ground. Heat bent light into pools that did not exist, but the people knew. They watched the insects. They followed the birds. Even the flight of a beetle across a salt flat could be a clue, a compass needle pointing not north but toward hope. And when they moved light. Weight was the enemy. To walk long distances across salt and sand meant shedding excess. Tools were made to be multi-purpose, clothing to be breathable, shelters to be imagined more than built. The desert offered no comfort for those who tried to drag the old world into the new. Only those who became minimal, who let go of everything but knowledge, could survive its glare. The wind stripped not just the land, but the human spirit of pretense. What remains when everything else has been scoured away? What remains is essence. You learn what you truly need: a flake of obsidian, a pouch for seeds, a name for each wind. You learn that home is not a structure but a direction, that safety is not a wall but a knowing when to stop walking. You learn to be intimate with emptiness, to feel awe not in the abundance of nature, but in its refusal to apologize for being what it is. And still, they endured. Because endurance was no longer a choice, it was a skill, taught like basket weaving, practiced like song. Children learn to recognize the outlines of distant mountain ranges, to track how stars drifted between seasons, to feel the heat rising from the ground and know whether it would blister or merely burn. Every element of the environment became part of the curriculum, and the wind was the teacher who never stopped speaking. Its lessons were harsh, but clear. It gave nothing freely, but it took nothing personally. It was neither cruel nor kind. It simply was. And in accepting that, the people found clarity. The salt did not sting those who expected pain. The wind did not disorient those who travelled by its rhythm. In surrendering control, they found freedom. In forgetting water, they began to remember the wind, not as an enemy but as an inheritance, a force that would not hold them, but would carry them, a force that erased paths, yet showed them how to move without needing one. The wind was no longer what opposed them, it was what revealed the truth of the world they now inhabited, a world in which movement was the only constant, and silence the only promise. How do you leave behind a homeland that no longer exists and still call yourself rooted? They did it by anchoring to nothing but memory. Not in the way memory clings to images, but in the way it moves. Fluid, adaptive, alive. They began to think like the land, shifting, impermanent, raw. Their routes were not trails so much as gestures. Their destinations were not places so much as rhythms. They stopped thinking in terms of arrival, and instead became fluent in the act of continuing. From the dust of Lake Bonneville to the scorched basin of Lake Manly, the human presence adapted. Fire circles became temporary. Campsites were chosen for their shade and view of the wind's movement, not their proximity to water. Water could not be trusted. But the wind could be read. It was not dependable, but it was honest. This honesty shaped not just travel, but identity. To live in a world without maps was to become one. Each person carried a constellation of directions in their bones, routes inherited from grandparents, paths memorized from a sibling's near-death mistake, the precise moment a certain ravine fills with morning shade. The land did not need to be charted because it had already been embodied. What happens when the body becomes the archive? There are no surviving scrolls from these people, no tablets etched in stone, but there are traditions passed in oral form, detailing valleys that no longer hold water, dunes that have migrated like herds, and winds that shift their behaviour every few generations. The desert to them was never dead. It was shifting memory, and their stories held it in place. And as the winds grew harsher, the deserts expanded. Death Valley deepened, the Mojave stretched, the ancient wetlands folded into mirage, but the people did not disappear. They disappeared from the eyes of those who came later, perhaps. Those who sought fixed cities and straight roads and failed to find either. But the desert is not for the uninitiated. It hides its truths inside the ordinary. And those who learned to move with it were never lost. They were only hidden, and hidden they thrived. In silence, in salt, in the shadow of dunes shaped by 10,000 years of breath. They did not seek to tame the land, but to join it. They learned to follow wind the way others follow rivers. They mapped nothing, but remembered everything. They were the cartographers of impermanence, the keepers of movement, the listeners of silence. And in the call of the salt winds they found their answer. There are places in the American desert where the sun is not just light, it is judgment. It falls without hesitation on open stone and buried memory alike, bleaching bone and time into the same colour. And when the wind pulls away the thin veils of sand, what remains beneath is a question. A fractured femur. A stone knife beside a dry well. A jawbone with teeth still clenched in silence. What stories are left when only bones remain to speak? Long before we understood the heat of this land as a modern inconvenience, before air conditioning and hydration packs, there were people who stood beneath the same white sky, facing a very different kind of trial. They walked into the American interior not as conquerors, but as question askers, attempting to solve the riddle of survival with nothing but intuition and endurance. And some of them failed. Spectacularly. Quietly. Permanently. The deserts remember them. In Spirit Cave, nestled within the parched folds of western Nevada, archaeologists uncovered the mummified remains of a man who died more than 10,000 years ago. His body had been gently wrapped in tule matting, his bones still cradled by the earth in which he was placed. The preservation was accidental. Dry air and constant temperature turned his burial into a time capsule. But this was not just a body. This was a ledger, a record of what happens when adaptation meets the edge of possibility. Nearby, in the Paisley Caves of Oregon, coprolites, fossilized human feces, reveal the dietary desperation of the early desert dwellers. These weren't people feasting on bison and mammoth. They were scavenging for seeds, rodents, whatever could survive in the high desert extremes. The bones in these caves belonged to those who understood too late that the land was rewriting its rules. And still farther south, in Tule Springs near modern-day Las Vegas, stone tools were found beside extinct camel bones. But what's striking is not just the age of the tools, it's their placement. Scattered near a water source that was already vanishing even in their time. A forgotten attempt to live too close to the edge. Why do we only find these stories when it's already too late for their tellers? Because the desert is slow to reveal. It hoards its tragedies under silence, and only when the wind has scraped enough away does it allow us a glimpse. A flake of obsidian here, a burial bundle there, none of it complete, none of it conclusive, and yet each discovery shifts the story, makes it more human, less mythic. Because death, in these sun-choked places, was not heroic. It was usually quiet, often alone, and always shaped by timing. The wrong hour to walk, the wrong day to wait, the noonday sun was a sentence. A misstep in the shadowless hours could mean collapse. Dehydration didn't whisper. It arrived like a thief, one moment upright, the next, dizzy. The skin no longer sweating, the mouth dry beyond speech, a fall near a stone, and that stone becoming the marker of where a life ended. Not in panic, but in inevitability. What happens when the heat is not just background, but antagonist? It becomes a presence you negotiate with, a force you time your breath against. The people who survived here did not merely endure the sun, they developed an unspoken contract with it. Walk before it rises, rest when it commands the sky, move again as it begins to die. But those who broke this covenant, whether out of desperation or miscalculation, left their remains as lessons. Bleached, brittle, irrefutable. In the dry vault of a spirit cave, the man's bones show signs of healing from previous injuries, evidence that his people cared for their wounded. Yet, around his burial, no tools of abundance were found. No heavy adornments, no symbols of triumph. Only the minimal offerings of a people who knew the value of travelling light. And still, they stopped long enough to bury him, to cover him with woven tule, to press his existence gently back into the earth. Why bury the dead when the living are barely surviving? Because ritual is not a luxury. It is a map of meaning when the world dissolves into survival. It tells the living how to remain human while becoming animal enough to endure. In the Paisley Caves, fragments of red ochre, powdered iron used for symbolic purposes, cling to stone. It suggests ceremony, even as rabbits and desert plants became staples of the diet. Hunger did not erase reverence. The sun could take their water, but not their stories. Yet death was common, especially beneath the noonday light. Heatstroke, silent, swift, was a predator unlike the lions and dire wolves that once hunted these early people. There were signs, flushed skin, pounding temples, vision wavering like mirage. As the body heated, sweat slowed, muscles cramped, the mind wandered. If shade was too far away, if water was gone, if companions were too few to carry you, then the desert made its decision. You stayed where you fell. Bones tell us of curled bodies, hands near the face, as if shielding from a sun that showed no mercy. Burial itself became a lesson in logistics. They could not dig deep graves in hardened, sun-baked ground. Instead, bodies were laid in shallow depressions, covered with stones to keep scavengers away. Sometimes they were positioned in the direction of the wind, perhaps to allow the spirit to follow it, or perhaps simply to let the heat dry the body into preservation rather than decay. The line between spiritual and practical blurred under the sun. At Tule Springs, archaeologists have found hearths surrounded by charcoal and splintered bone. Nearby, fragments of human remains lay beside water-worn cobbles and stone scrapers. Was this the site of a death, or of a choice to stay and try again? We do not know, but the stones remember footprints, even when the sand does not. The land became an arithmetic problem with brutal precision. How far can a body walk before water is needed? How long can shade be trusted to remain? How many breaths can one take before the wind shifts and the sun reclaims the world? Survival became mathematics, not of numbers, but of shadows, heartbeats, and silence. And those who solved it lived to see another dawn. But not everyone did. For every traveller who made it from one shadowed canyon to the next, there was someone who did not. For every camp that nestled safely near a hidden spring, there were others who bet wrong. On the cloud that never rained, the spring that ran dry, the wind that blew hot when it should have cooled. And it is those decisions, those tiny misreadings of a vast changing world, that fill the archaeological record with a haunting stillness. Bones beneath the sun are not just remains, they are equations unsolved. We imagine the past too often as triumph, invention, discovery, conquest. But in this chapter of human existence, the story is mostly about learning the hard way, about trying and failing again and again until the knowledge became instinct, until the heat could be felt not just on the skin but in the mind, an awareness shaped by exposure, suffering, and the slow accumulation of patterns. Shade became a form of currency. To know where a shadow fell at exactly midday in the middle of July was to hold a piece of survival. It might be the gap between boulders, the arch of a basalt overhang, the corner of a canyon wall that tilted just enough to offer a sliver of reprieve. Children were taught to spot these places, to memorize them, to return when needed. It was not enough to find shelter. You had to anticipate it. Time your movement not just by distance, but by sun angle and wind cooling. Silence, too, became a tool. In the midday heat, noise was excess. Talking burned energy. Sound attracted scavengers. Listening, by contrast, preserved energy and revealed what mattered. The buzz of flies near a water source, the chirping of birds that had found a seep, the sudden absence of insect noise that meant a predator might be near. The land spoke quietly, and those who heard it lived. The mathematics of survival was never written down, but it was absolute. 2 hours of walking meant 4 hours of rest. 1 swallow of water needed to last 6 more. The human body could travel about 5 kilometers before dehydration began to affect cognition. A person could survive 3 days without water, but in desert heat that timeline was shorter, much shorter, so they learned to read clouds like clocks. To test the direction of the wind with fingers held aloft, to walk when the sky was pink and sleep when it turned white. Even the rituals adapted. Burials, once communal events, became streamlined acts of necessity. In extreme heat, decomposition could begin within hours. The body had to be dealt with quickly, respectfully but efficiently. Burial sites began to cluster near seasonal water sources, perhaps because people died there, or because the living needed to remember where the land had once been kind. Stones were stacked, not just to mark the dead, but to mark the wisdom won by their loss. Every death was a teacher, every bone a page in the manual of endurance. And yet knowledge in this world wasn't just accumulated, it was earned, again and again, beneath skies that offered no forgiveness. Across generations, those who survived passed down not just tools or tactics, but a philosophy, survived by learning, not by resisting. Adaptation became the core of their culture. To resist the heat, the drought, the silence was to perish. But to notice, to anticipate, to yield at just the right moment, that was survival. In this arithmetic of existence, the young watched the old with reverence. The desert aged people quickly, but it also made them precious. An elder who remembered the summer when the northern arroyo had one last trickle of water, even after the southern creeks had gone dry, might hold the key to a tribe's migration decision. Stories were more than stories. They were temperature records, topographic cues, behavioral manuals. A tale about a woman who slept too late and never returned was not myth. It was a warning. The desert rewarded memory. And so these people mapped their world not with ink but with footsteps and flame. A ring of firestones left in an ancient wash might speak across centuries. Water was once here. A pile of bones laid neatly beneath a rock overhang might whisper, this was a place of rest. Shade and silence became sacred not because of belief, but because of what they made possible. Breath, sleep, one more hour of life. We know from Spirit Cave and Tule Springs that people returned to the same places, generation after generation. Not because they stayed, these were not settled lives, but because certain places held knowledge. The contours of survival etched into the land were subtle but repeatable. A shallow depression in a dry basin might signal a seasonal spring. A scattering of juniper seeds on the ground might hint at animal paths. Over time, people learned to read these clues with the same precision modern society reserves for road signs and weather apps. But nothing in this world was guaranteed. The desert changed faster than tradition. One year, a route might be passable. The next, a dry thunderstorm might have reshaped the canyon with a flash flood. Even today, the sediment layers at ancient sites show sudden shifts, periods where lake beds turned to mudflats in just a few seasons. And those who did not notice in time became part of the archaeological record. It is this fragility that makes the surviving evidence feel so heavy. Not heavy in mass, but in meaning. A stone scraper beside a skeleton is not just a tool and a body, it's a final act. The attempt to work, to cut, to eat, interrupted forever. The ochre dust on a fingertip fossilized in clay is not just pigment. It's an echo of a moment where someone chose to express, even as the world constricted, even as the sun bore down like a god without mercy, and in these smallest of traces we see the outlines of people who were not unlike us. They loved, they faltered, they solved and they failed. They stood beneath the same sun and asked the same question we still ask today. How do we survive what we cannot control? The difference is that their answers came not in climate reports or digital forecasts, but in footsteps and instincts, in how long they stared at the horizon before deciding which way to walk. In Spirit Cave, the remains of that one man, now known as Spirit Cave Man, have become a symbol of endurance. DNA tells us he is one of the oldest known inhabitants of the Americas, his ancestry linking him to living indigenous tribes of the region. But DNA cannot tell us why he died when he did. It cannot tell us if he was a leader, a loner, or someone simply caught in the wrong place when the last waterhole dried. That silence is permanent, and perhaps that's what the desert teaches best, how to live with silence. There is no noise in the archives of bone, only the long, sun-baked wait for someone to notice, to kneel in the dust, to ask a question, to imagine, not just data, but emotion. The fear of the last day, the clarity of watching shadows shorten too fast, the calm that comes when the body understands its limits have been reached. To look at these remains is to be reminded of the thinness of the line we all walk. Even with our technologies, our cities, our climate-controlled shelters, we are not separate from this story. We are its continuation. The same sun that once scalded the skin of the early desert travelers still burns above us. The same winds still shape the canyons, and the same fragility of water, of missteps, of timing, still underlies our existence. But from these ancient deaths came ancient wisdom. Desert peoples learned to watch not the water, but the land, to see the ghost of moisture in the way a plant leaned, to dig for hidden reserves by following the flight of birds or the tracks of deer. They learned to move in shadows, to rest through the white light of noon, and to treat each fire as a temporary gift. And perhaps most profoundly, they learned that to survive here was not to fight the land, but to become fluent in its silences. These lessons still live on. in the songs of indigenous nations whose ancestors passed through Spirit Cave and Tule Springs, in the oral histories that remember where water once sang, in the sacredness of heat and light, not as enemies, but as teachers, and in our growing understanding that climate is not a backdrop. It is the stage, the script, and sometimes the final word. Bones beneath the sun are not tragedies. They are warnings. They are offerings. They are signs etched in calcium and time, asking us not to mourn, but to listen, to adjust, to remember that survival has never been a guarantee. It has always been a choice, and more than that, a craft. A craft shaped in silence, sharpened by heat, and buried in the dust, waiting to be found. Under a sun that had claimed many lives and silenced many names, something remarkable began to stir. Not in the sky or soil, but in the minds of the people who refused to vanish. For generations, survival in the American Southwest had been a game of odds, a breathless wager against the heat. But now the players had changed the rules. These were no longer wanderers reacting to the whims of a harsh world. They were observers, thinkers, adapters. They were becoming masters of thirst. How does a person learn to listen to a land that speaks in parched whispers? How do you find water in a place where rivers have turned to scars and clouds are more memory than promise? The answer begins not in the blaze of noon, but in the hush of darkness. As the days grew hotter, the people shifted their lives to the night. It was not a sudden change, but a quiet turning of the dial, rituals and routines slowly slipping into the cooler margins of the clock. At night the body conserved moisture, sweat evaporated more slowly. Feet moved more surely across the rocks, eyes adjusted to moonlight, and ears became attuned to the calls of nocturnal creatures. Migration became a choreography, performed in silver light. Silent feet padding over basalt, woven sandals pressing gently into powdery soil still warm from the day's fire. Children were taught to sleep through the sun and wake with the stars. Their internal clocks synced to the rhythms of temperature, not time. Why cling to the hours that kill when there are hours that forgive? But travelling by night was not just cooler, it was an education. Shadows made the land strange, unfamiliar. A rock seen 100 times in daylight became mysterious by starlight. The people learned to memorize not just paths, but the feel of the ground beneath their feet. A patch of gravel signaled a bend in the canyon. A dry bush, brittle and sharp, hinted at nearby water seep. Navigation became intimate, almost instinctive. And when the moon was gone and clouds veiled the stars, they stopped. They waited. Because to move without knowing in this world was not bravery, it was surrender. It was during these nighttime wanderings that another revolution took root. The people, once transient and reactive, began to engineer their own survival. In a land with no streams, they carried water. But how do you carry what is invisible, elusive, vital? The answer lay in the things the desert did not consume. Animal bladders, cleaned and dried, became vessels, flexible, lightweight and natural. Hollow gourds, sealed with pitch, were tucked into leather straps and carried across great distances. Woven baskets, waterproofed with pine resin or sap, held precious litres. Some tribes dug shallow pits in shaded areas, lining them with stone and covering them with bark to trap condensation or capture runoff from the rare and sudden rains. These were not just containers. They were declarations. We will not wait for kindness. We will build our own terms. And in those quiet hours, with water sloshing gently on their backs, they walked, always listening, always watching, always remembering that in this land survival belonged not to the strongest, but to the most attuned. To master thirst was not simply to find water, but to become intimate with its moods, its absences, its disguises. And so the desert dwellers became archivists of subtlety. They tracked water not just by where it was, but by what noticed it first. Animals were the earliest messengers. Not just the obvious ones, thirsty coyotes sniffing along dry riverbeds, but the quiet, delicate ones, beetles that clustered near dew-slick stones, ants whose tunnels angled toward moisture. By watching the behaviour of insects, birds and rodents, people could infer not just the presence of water, but its depth and permanence. A jackrabbit sprinting straight across the salt flats might signal nothing, but a quail emerging cautiously from the same area at dawn might suggest a seep still hidden under stone. These were not guesses, they were readings, signs understood through repetition, tested by risk. And then there were the stars, not merely for direction, though they did serve as sky compasses during nighttime migrations, but as seasonal clocks. Certain constellations, when rising just above the horizon, signalled the coming of monsoon rains or warned of drought years. These celestial cues were tracked over generations. Grandparents told their children, who told theirs, which stars to watch and what they meant. When Sirius blinked just before dawn, it might mean the high desert springs would refill. When Orion dipped too low too early, it might mean dry lightning without rain. The sky was not a backdrop. It was an oracle. Still, there were times when all signs failed. When the sun grew merciless, the air brittle, and every known water source had vanished into mirage. In those moments, it was not tools or trackers that saved the people, but scent, creosote. The resinous bush that dots the American Southwest exudes a pungent, unmistakable aroma, especially after the rare desert rains. But even in the dry season, the scent of creosote changes when water lingers underground. The roots stretch deep, and when they drink, the oils shift. The people learn to smell that difference, to breathe in the wind and know if it passed over damp roots or dead soil. They followed the scent like a thread. Sometimes it led nowhere, a false trail. Other times it ended in salvation, a shaded spring beneath boulders, a clay-lined depression still wet to the touch. To the untrained, the desert was a void. To those who lived within it, it was crowded with signals. The desert was not empty, it was encoded. This understanding, the ability to interpret and anticipate, to store and move, was not just a survival skill, it was a world view, one in which every motion had consequence, every sound mattered, every pause meant something, and through this worldview, they began to move not as intruders, but as participants. The desert did not become easier, it never would. But the people at last were no longer strangers. They began to move with the rhythm of heat and shadow, as if they were born from it. Children learned early that the desert was not a place to be conquered, but a dialogue to be entered. Ask nothing loudly. Take nothing without offering silence in return. Their elders taught them that thirst was not a failure of the land, it was a question. And like all questions the earth asked, it demanded awareness, patience, and respect. By now, migration was no longer wandering. It was choreography. Not a desperate search for what remained, but a deliberate movement toward what might be. Camps were placed with mathematical intent. Not near stagnant water, but near where water might briefly appear, the base of a dry canyon wall, where fissures hinted at seepage beneath, the downwind side of a granite boulder where dew collected before sunrise, the roots of agave, swollen with hidden liquid, cut at dawn when the sugars were lowest and the moisture highest. In the cool hours before light returned, fires were extinguished not with water, but with sand. Tools were packed, baskets filled, sleeping mats rolled tightly, and always, someone walked ahead in silence, testing the ground with their heel, sniffing the air for moisture or dust. They were not leaders in the way we might imagine, but listeners, those who knew when to move and when not to. And still, water was never guaranteed, so they learned to trap it, at the mouths of shallow caves or beneath sandstone shelves. They dug small hollows, lining them with smooth stones and sealing them with slabs to keep out heat and animals. In the rare event of rain, these pits captured runoff drop by drop. Some families returned to them months later, lifting the stone lids to find only a few mouthfuls. But in this world, a few mouthfuls meant life. They also learned to shape the land itself, not in grand dams or canals, that would come millennia later, but in small, meticulous gestures. They carved channels in clay to funnel night condensation into woven bowls. They buried pots filled with soaked animal bladders, covered them in earth to keep them cool. They used hollow bones as siphons. They chewed mesquite pods not for sweetness, but to trick the tongue into remembering saliva. Water became more than a resource. It became a craft. To carry it was an art of balance, not only in weight but in judgment, Carry too much, and you slow the group, burning energy before the sun even rises. Carry too little, and you may collapse before the next spring. So they calculated. They weighed risks in heartbeats and footsteps, in how long a person could walk before their vision blurred, in how the wind changed taste just before a heat storm. And all the while, they listened to crickets, to wind, to the absence of both. Because mastery did not mean control. It meant harmony with something terrifyingly greater than themselves. And so, with every mile walked under darkness, every drop stored beneath stone, every decision to wait instead of walk, the people became more than survivors. They became fluent in thirst. And fluency, in this sense, meant surrendering the illusion of dominance. No longer striving to conquer the desert, they turned to living within its logic, memorizing its patterns, bending to its cycles. They did not resist the silence of the dry months or curse the capriciousness of storms. They waited, they prepared. And when the sky cracked open and water returned, even briefly, they moved like dancers to a long-remembered song. Some stayed behind. Not all movement was physical. In certain regions, families became caretakers of memory. They maintained sacred catchments, cleaned stone-lined pits, redug channels choked by sand. These were not villages in the settled sense. They were pauses in the journey entrusted to those who knew when to stay still. These seasonal nodes of water and gathering became crucial. In the harshest months, they were oases. In the cooler seasons, they were meeting grounds where families shared knowledge, tools, stories, and, most importantly, maps of the invisible. Maps that couldn't be drawn. Instead, they were sung, or danced, or traced in the dust with a fingertip, then erased as the wind picked up. These were the nomads' libraries, oral cartographies layered with metaphor and practical precision. A verse about a coyote's leap might encode the distance between two springs. A lullaby could carry the sequence of turns to reach a rock shelter that held a water cache sealed with pitch. Each generation had to learn the songs, and each generation altered them slightly, as the land shifted, as springs vanished and others emerged. It was not just adaptation, it was evolution, encoded in music and rhythm and breath. And perhaps nothing exemplified this mastery more than how they spoke of thirst itself. It wasn't simply a biological warning, it was a character in their lives, respected, feared, bargained with. Stories told of spirits that tested travellers with mirages, of voices that whispered false directions in the heat. To be thirsty was not only to need water, it was to face temptation, hallucination, error. So children were taught to doubt what they saw, to double-check every shadow, to never trust the easy path, especially when exhausted. Thirst, in this way, became a spiritual teacher. Those who grew up in this landscape learned to revere restraint. The best path was rarely the shortest. The coldest drink was the one not touched. To delay gratification was not moralism, it was mathematics. Survival was calculated in slow, deliberate sips. And through this lens, even suffering became sacred. The parched mouth, the burning eyes, the long march across hot sand, these were rites, not punishments. Proof that one had joined the lineage of those who came before. Proof that one was still within the story, not yet among the bones. In time, their relationship to water began to resemble something closer to religion. A reverence not for an abstract god, but for the pure, fleeting miracle of liquid in a land shaped by fire. And when they found it, when a finger sank into cool mud, or a pool shimmered behind stones, it wasn't just relief, it was grace. To kneel before water in a desert was not a moment of dominance, it was a surrender. A recognition that you had been allowed to continue for another day, another journey. And in this sacred exchange, water was never just consumed, it was thanked. Leftover droplets were returned to the earth, hands were washed before drinking, songs were sung softly as lips touched the surface, not as ceremony, but as gratitude. From this reverence came a culture deeply rooted in conservation, not in modern terms, but in ancestral intuition. The desert did not forgive waste, and so waste was unknown. A cracked basket was patched with sinew. A leaking gourd was sealed with heated resin. Even breath was measured, speech minimal, footsteps chosen with care. To live was to ration not just water, but energy, emotion, noise. Every act was a calculation. In their quiet mastery, these people reshaped the concept of abundance. It no longer meant excess, it meant precision. Enough was not measured by fullness, but by continuity. Could the family reach the next shelter? Could the old woman rest long enough to recover? Could the infant be swaddled in shade while the father dug for a spring? Survival was stitched together by these small threads, and when someone passed, when thirst overcame strength, their body was not discarded. It was cradled by the land, buried near water if possible, or at the foot of a sheltering rock. Offerings were left, bits of food, smooth stones, tiny effigies carved from bone, not because they believed it would help the dead, but because the living needed to remember. To survive here was a privilege bought at great cost. Each death was a teacher, each grave a map. Their memory echoed in the desert silence, in the way wind paused briefly near old cairns, or how animals avoided certain paths out of ancestral instinct. Knowledge was not just passed down, it was layered, fossilized into behavior. Even today, traces remain, in the faded petroglyphs of canteens, in trails still followed by modern indigenous tribes, in place names that whisper of springs long dried but not forgotten. They were never isolated. Though the southwest was harsh, it was not empty. Trade routes spanned great distances, shells from the Pacific, turquoise from distant mines, plant resins from Mexico, all moved through the hands of these desert masters. But water remained the greatest treasure, a currency too sacred to barter, too precious to own. It belonged to no one and everyone. And so, they taught their children that power was not found in conquest, but in cooperation, with land, with weather, with each other. The strongest person was not the loudest, but the most observant. The wisest elder was not the one who gave orders, but the one who could smell a storm 2 days away. By the time centuries passed and new groups arrived, those who would build cities and fences and wells, the desert already had its authors. Their lessons remained, written not on parchment, but in shadow and heat. They were not just survivors. They were architects of resilience, quiet scientists of scarcity. They were the first to prove that in a world ruled by thirst, knowledge is the only oasis. Even in the most sun-scoured corners of the earth, meaning clings to what remains. A single strand of twisted fibre embedded in the dry silt of Nevada's Black Rock Desert tells us not just that someone once passed this way, but that they stayed, that they crafted, endured, solved. That they listened to what the land would allow. In a place where even the wind seems to forget its name, a pair of sandals survives, fashioned from sagebrush and raw intuition. They are not relics of vanity. They are arguments for life, quiet, functional, profound. What does it mean to walk barefoot across a land that burns your soles by mid-morning? What must it have taken to imagine protection, to twist desert fibre into a weave strong enough to carry your weight, but porous enough to breathe? Found preserved in the dry alkaline crust of Lovelock and nearby caves, these sandals, some over 10,000 years old, are among the oldest footwear ever discovered in North America. But more than their age, it is their intention that strikes us. These were not improvisations, they were designs, consistent and clever. The weavers knew which fibres resisted rot, which absorbed too much moisture. Some soles were reinforced with tighter spirals near the heel, others flared slightly at the toe, suggesting not just protection but comfort, even style. Is this not technology? Not merely stone spears and fire drills, but the invention of ease, of movement, of dignity under duress? And if so, then fibre is the unsung backbone of survival. In those early desert lives, before cities and metallurgy, before wheels and writing, fibre was everything. It tied bundles, it slung infants, it knotted fish traps, stitched blankets, tethered tools. It turned a raw, unforgiving world into something one could carry. And fibre survives in silence. Unlike stone or bone, it decays into invisibility unless the environment conspires to preserve it, unless the sand is dry enough, the air still enough, the hands that wove it skillful enough to leave a trace worth saving. That is why the sandals matter. They are not just evidence of motion, but of forethought. Someone, perhaps a woman watching her children cross a sunlit ridge, sat down with stalks of Indian hemp or wild flax and twisted future into form. And what of the hands that moved so patiently, so expertly, in that moment before sunrise? Did they whisper to themselves? Did they hum? Did they sit in total silence, listening for the sound of distant footsteps or approaching heat? In these small hand-woven objects we glimpse not just adaptation, but a kind of elegance, a quiet agreement with the land that said, "I will not fight you, but I will move through you with care." And isn't that its own kind of intelligence? Not the noisy blaze of conquest, but the soft logic of survival, not domination, but dialogue. How do you record such a conversation? One not written in ink, but in knots and footfalls and fibres twisted by the rhythm of a desert wind. Perhaps the answer lies in objects that remain long after voices fade. Stone tools carved with precision and worn smooth from years of use tell us that survival was not merely reaction, it was craft. In the shadowed recesses of caves like Lovelock and Spirit Cave, archaeologists uncover more than spear points meant for hunting. They find scrapers, awls, drills, and baskets, items not built to kill, but to sustain. Tools of care, tools of continuation. Scrapers shaped from chert or obsidian were used to clean hides, not for decoration, but to create soft leather for clothing and water pouches. Awls, simple, tapered points of bone or antler, pierced holes into leather and fibre, stitching together sandals, blankets, and carrying nets. Some were so finely polished they fit perfectly in the palm, moulded by generations of hands. These were not weapons, they were instruments of quiet persistence. And then there were the baskets, coiled, twined, and woven from willow, sagebrush, and rabbit brush. Some were waterproofed with pine pitch or ash, built to hold not only seeds and roots but water itself. Imagine the hope in such a thing, a family weaving together grass and memory, creating something that could cradle the rarest substance in their world. Hope, preserved in spiral patterns. Some of these baskets were found still holding their contents, charred pinion nuts, remnants of cattail pollen cakes, dried berries. Food carried across days of scorching silence. Food meant not just for the living, but sometimes for the dead, buried beside them as offerings for a journey farther than any desert trail. Stone-lined hearths tell their own story. Built low to the ground to shield flame from wind, they formed small sanctuaries of warmth in a world of cold nights and blistering days. Fires were not allowed to spread or roar, they were taught to whisper. A tight ring of basalt stones kept embers contained, embers that could be buried in ash at dawn and carried smouldering until night returned. These hearths were more than places to cook. They were anchors, places where stories were shared, where lessons were passed down, how to find water, how to hear wind, how to read stars. These people were not primitive, they were mathematicians of scarcity. They calculated shade, they predicted evaporation, they knew how long a pool would last under a particular sky. Their tools reflected this, small, portable, efficient, light enough to carry, strong enough to last. Tools that did not shout their presence, tools that did not disturb the land. And beneath all this, woven into fibre, chipped into stone, etched into footsteps, lived silence. Silence was not emptiness. It was technique, to move across salt flats without stirring dust, to speak in gestures when sound would carry, to listen to the creak of cooling rock after sunset and know if the night would freeze or remain mild. Silence became as vital as any tool, a way to exist without waking the attention of heat, predators, or spirits of the land. It is a language we have almost forgotten, but here, among the tools and the stillness, it waits, patient as stone. In the open spaces between canyons and the hard light of midday, the people who dwelled here began to understand that sound itself was a resource, one to be guarded, rationed, and deployed with intention. Silence, in this world, was not merely the absence of noise. It was a living instrument, a form of knowledge passed from generation to generation, with as much care as a stone blade or a fire starter. To move in silence meant more than tiptoeing through sand. It was about noticing the texture of the ground before stepping, understanding which grasses crackled in the heat and which ones whispered instead. It was the art of waiting for the wind before shifting positions, so your scent and movement travelled with it rather than against. Hunters learned to time their breath with the pauses of their prey. Foragers practiced stillness so complete that even lizards mistook them for stone. But silence was not only tactical, it was emotional. In the desert, where the weight of heat could press down like a hand on the chest, excessive talking drained more than moisture. It scattered attention. When water was scarce, so was language. Brevity became a form of love, to speak without wasting breath, to listen with the fullness of the body. In this way, silence also became a space for memory. Stories were not shouted into the void. They were carried like coals in the dark, glowing softly, shared at just the right moment. Around hearths, in the hush before dawn, a grandparent might whisper the location of a hidden spring encoded in metaphor. A child might repeat a rhythm of footfalls designed to mimic a rabbit's hop across dry terrain, teaching not just movement but mimicry, how to become invisible in plain sight. And tools were made to support this silence. Sandals designed not only for durability but for stealth. Some had soles textured with patterns that broke up tracks, confusing would-be trackers. Others were so finely braided that they wrapped the foot like a second skin, muffling impact even across brittle stone. Baskets were carried low and close to the body, preventing spills and rustling. Arrowheads were stored in padded leather pouches, not just to protect the sharp edge, but to quiet it. There were even stories of scouts who moved exclusively at night, communicating only with hand signs and glances. In such conditions, sound became sacred. A single cough might betray a camp. A dropped tool could scatter a herd. In this world, the mastery of quiet was not asceticism. It was defense. To walk without being noticed, to craft without being heard, to survive without leaving a trace. It was a form of artistry that modern life rarely requires. But it was once as vital as fire, and in their silence they heard everything. The crackle of a distant branch, the sigh of a wind between cliffs, the breath of the land adjusting to the sun. For those who could listen, the desert spoke, not in words, but in stone, in shadow, in silence that meant survival. And survival, for these early desert peoples, did not rest on brute strength or domination of nature. It depended on negotiation, humility, and the delicate partnership with an unforgiving world. Each tool, whether made from stone, fibre, or bone, was part of this dialogue, a humble offering placed into the hands of the land, with the hope that it might accept and allow continued passage. Consider the agave, spiny, bitter, defensive. Yet hidden within its heart was sustenance, a starchy core rich in calories, hard to access without knowledge. To reach it, early desert dwellers used drilling tools, sharpened stone set into wooden handles, or bone-tipped implements that could split and scoop the dense flesh of the agave root. The process was not fast. It required patience, timing, and a deep respect for the plant's rhythms, harvesting at just the right season, after the sugars had concentrated but before the plant turned woody. This was a different kind of hunting, one not marked by pursuit and blood, but by stillness and skill. These tools were not about seizing a kill, they were about coaxing nourishment from unwilling ground. The people who wielded them were botanists as much as foragers. They knew which plants held moisture, which roots could be eaten raw, which ones required roasting in earth ovens for hours to remove toxins. They understood the subtle changes in coloration that meant safety, the faint patterns on bark that signalled ripeness. Their tools reflected this precision. The cutting edges were sharp but not overly broad, perfect for shaving, trimming, not hacking. They were carried in woven sheaths tied to the waist, always within reach but rarely brandished. These were not tools of aggression, but of communion. In their worn handles and smoothed edges, you can feel the accumulation of quiet encounters, the pause before cutting, the breath held during extraction, the satisfaction of peeling away resistance to find something edible beneath. But perhaps the most profound aspect of these tools is not how they were used, but how they were maintained, sharpened by sandstone, cleaned with chewed sage, wrapped tightly to prevent rattling. If a tool broke, its shards were not discarded, they were reworked. A broken drill tip might become a scraper, a snapped awl, a pendant. Nothing was wasted, because in the desert, waste was the first step toward death. Even today, archaeologists recover caches buried beneath layers of dust, carefully stored collections of tools bundled in fibre, tucked beneath rocks or into shallow pits. Perhaps they were emergency kits, left behind by travellers expecting to return, or perhaps they were offerings laid down in thanks to the land itself. In either case, the message is clear. Tools were not extensions of power, they were contracts. Agreements to live lightly, to take only what was given, to move not as owners of the earth but as its respectful guests. And with that humility came a deeper kind of intelligence, one forged not in conquest, but in restraint. In the language of stone and silence, tools were not loud declarations of dominance. They were whispers of understanding. They did not say, "I will break this world open." They said, "I will learn how it breathes." Nowhere is this more evident than in the way people travel together. To journey across the vastness of the Great Basin or the Mojave, they formed caravans not of beasts and wheels, but of footsteps and memory. Children walked lightly, imitating their elders. Their sandals, woven from sagebrush bark or twisted yucca fibres, were padded enough to protect, but thin enough to feel. Because to lose the feel of the land beneath your feet was to lose your way. Silence, too, refined how they moved. To travel in heat meant keeping one's mouth closed, preserving moisture. To speak unnecessarily was to waste water, so they spoke through nods, glances, the shifting of shoulders, the raising of a finger to indicate a change in direction. Entire conversations occurred beneath breath, or not at all. Language lost volume but gained precision. And when they stopped, tools were laid gently in circles of stone, small hearths built to contain fire without drawing attention. Flames were kept low, thin, almost invisible. The crack of wood was avoided. Instead, they burned roots, dung, and dry brush. Even fire, humanity's most defiant creation, was softened into something quiet, cooperative. There were no written words. There were no monuments, yet their ideas endured. In the curvature of a sandal's sole, in the polish of a hand tool passed from mother to daughter, in the woven basin that once held rainwater, now turned to dust but still echoing with purpose. The desert preserved what the people built, not because it was grand, but because it was honest. It belonged to the land as much as the stones or the wind. And in this quiet brilliance, we see something we often forget. Technology does not begin with metal. It does not begin with wheels or engines. It begins with attention, with the choice to observe, to refine, to perfect what seems simple until it becomes sacred. They listened to the silence of drying riverbeds and answered with woven sandals. They watched the shadows of canyon walls and invented drills, baskets, and stone-lined hearths. They felt the sting of thirst and responded not with rage but with skill. Stone, fibre, silence. These were the first tools of civilization in the desert. Not weapons, but agreements. Agreements between human hands and an unforgiving world. And because of them, the story did not end here, under the burning sun. It continued. It moved forward, into the next spring, into the next migration, into the next chapter of memory. And that is where we will follow. It began, not with a spark, but with a question. What if the land could listen? Not to words, not to the cries of thirst or the hush of sandals moving through dust, but to fire, low and slow, not of violence but of invitation. For tens of thousands of years human hands had yielded to the rhythm of the land. But now, as the earth exhaled into warmth and the grasses of the basin dried into whispers, something shifted. The people, those same quiet guests of the desert, began to speak back. They did so with flame. Picture them before dawn, standing at the edge of a valley scrubbed with greasewood and brittlebrush, long before any white man would call it Nevada, long before even the word desert was said in any tongue. The air is still, its cold sharpness clinging to their skin. In their palms they cradle small bundles of fire starter, resinous pine pitch, dry sage twigs, rabbit dung, protected from the night's dew. Then, without ceremony, they bend to the earth and ignite the brush. The fire creeps, not leaps. It moves as they do, carefully. They feed it gently, coaxing it through the underbrush. The smoke rises in columns like breath, lifting skyward and dissolving into the silence. Behind the fire's path, the land is blackened but not ruined. It is awakened. What happens when fire is not a force of erasure but of memory? This is not the fire of disaster, of screaming forests or falling embers. This is fire as punctuation, as grammar, as prayer. It carves into the ecosystem with intent, clearing the overgrowth, releasing seeds locked in resin, calling green shoots to rise in its wake. Within weeks, the blackened fields will shimmer with new growth, nutrient-rich plants that draw grazing animals back toward the waiting hunters: deer, bighorn sheep, rodents. With them come the predators, coyotes, mountain lions, and the full web of a food chain realigned by human fire. It is not manipulation, it is choreography. Anthropologists now trace this dance across the western deserts of North America. Beneath layers of sediment in places like Owens Valley or the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, they find bands of charcoal resting above richer soil profiles. These aren't random remnants of lightning strikes, they are fingerprints of intention. Each layer marks a generation that understood fire not as threat, but as dialogue, a negotiation, a carefully struck bargain with the land. What kind of courage does it take to burn the very world you depend on? To stand in a place where water is rare, where shade is sacred, and still set flame to the brush, knowing that your survival depends not on preserving every blade, but on sacrificing some for the return of life. It is a lesson in paradox, that sometimes destruction is the price of continuity. That by choosing when and how to burn, these desert ancestors avoided the chaos of uncontrolled wildfire. They turned chaos into strategy. They burned not out of panic, but out of faith. Faith that the land, like them, remembered. That if they gave it flame in winter or early spring, when the air was cool and the soil still held the echo of snowmelt, it would answer not with fury, but with abundance. And in time, it did. Fresh shoots of rice grass, biscuit root, and fireweed rose from the ashes. Rodents returned to forage, deer came to graze, and with them came life renewed. For a people who once depended solely on following water, a new kind of certainty emerged. They could shape the land not by force but by rhythm. To understand how revolutionary this was, one must look down, into the earth, into layers of memory only the soil can keep. Archaeologists kneeling in dry lake beds or canyon floors find thin stripes of charcoal lying above pale loam and clay. These are the signatures of human intent. They appear not once but in cycles, 10, 20, 50-year intervals, and in each stratum the remnants of quiet, chosen fire. These charcoal bands are not random. They do not match patterns of lightning-sparked burns, which leave behind erratic, jagged traces. Instead, they form controlled horizontal planes, black seams between centuries of dust. Fingerprints of a people who knew how to burn without destroying, who learned to speak to the land in a language older than agriculture. This wasn't farming, and it wasn't destruction. It was something in between, cultivation by patience. Imagine standing in one of these ancient burn fields just after the flames have died. The air is thick with the metallic scent of char. The ground is warm beneath your feet. In the dim orange light of dawn, smoke drifts upward in thin ribbons, joining the pale stars. There are no cheering crowds, no drums, no declarations that they have tamed the desert. Only quiet, only breath. Only the knowledge that now the land has heard them. The people soon learned fire could do more than grow grass. It could guide. Smoke, rising into the pale blue of the morning sky, could be seen from valleys away. It could tell distant companions where to gather. It could warn them of drought or invite them toward ripening fields. Smoke became a line across the sky, an invisible trail where no footprints could last. There are accounts, passed down through oral traditions of indigenous tribes, of congregations timed by fire, of families from distant ranges travelling under starlight toward the thin grey smudge on the horizon, knowing someone was calling, not with words, but with ash and ember. In this way, fire became more than warmth or danger. It became signal. Not the blinding terror of lightning storms or the roaring inferno of summer wildfires, but a soft, deliberate gesture that said, "Here, now, come." And yet, fire was still dangerous. It always was. To wield it required humility. Light it too late in the season, and the wind might turn it wild. Light it too close to dry river reeds, and you might lose the very water you depend on. So the people studied not just flame, but everything flame touches: humidity, wind, soil, season, shadow. They became interpreters of smoke, negotiators of heat, and the land in return offered green, but not just green. It offered presence, a sense of being watched, listened to, and trusted. When the people burned brush at dawn, they weren't imposing change. They were stepping into a conversation that had already begun. Coyotes would arrive first, sniffing the charred ground, then rabbits warily testing the edges, then birds dancing in the updrafts of heat and ash. Insects returned, pollinators buzzing in zigzag paths above new shoots. What we call ecology today, they experienced as ceremony. They didn't have the words for carbon cycle or biodiversity, but they knew what it meant when too much brush grew unchecked. They saw how roots failed to take hold, how game animals avoided dense thickets, how the land seemed to withhold itself in exhaustion. So they used fire to reset, not just the plants, but the balance. The breath between too much and too little. The archaeological record bears witness to this understanding, subtle though it may be. In scattered corners of the Great Basin, archaeologists have uncovered patches of earth where charcoal layers intersect with caches of seeds, game bones and tools, indicating that fire wasn't just a background condition, it was part of the harvest itself, set intentionally, timed carefully. Part of the choreography of survival. These fires didn't blaze uncontrollably. They were bounded by knowledge, ignited when winds were calm, fed in pulses, ringed with fire breaks drawn from observation, not mathematics. And after the burn there was no abandonment. The people returned to tend, to wait, to gather. Fire was only the first step in a long unfolding. Even the very smell of fire became a signal, not just to people, but to the land itself. The bitter scent of burning creosote or juniper would awaken seeds lying dormant beneath the surface. Some of these seeds were pyrophilic, needing fire to germinate. Without fire, they would never grow at all. The land, it turns out, is not only tolerant of fire, in many places it longs for it. The people of this landscape did not seek dominion. Their fires were not empires made flame. They understood they were small, temporary and dependent. But even within that humility, they learned they could shape the world, carefully, gently, with fire held like breath between cupped hands. There is something profoundly intimate in the act of a controlled burn, the way it requires you to kneel close, to watch, not command, to feel the heat not as punishment, but as promise. This was the gift of fire not as destruction, but as invitation. It asked nothing but timing. It gave everything in return. And so they lit their fires not in fear, but in wisdom. Not to fight the desert, but to remind it that they too belonged. Smoke against the sky was not a flare of desperation, but a signature, written in ash, read by wind, and remembered by the roots waiting just below the surface. And with each deliberate burn the land whispered back in green. New shoots of rabbit brush and sage emerged. Pronghorn, mule deer and bighorn sheep returned to graze, their hoofprints etching new stories into the soot-softened ground. Even the insects, bees, beetles, moths, returned to pollinate the land the fire had just reset. It was not a scorched wasteland. It was a promise, a contract renewed between fire, land, and the people who lived lightly across it. This is why, centuries later, when archaeologists dig through stratified soil in desert basins, they do not just find ash. They find patterns. A charcoal layer here, followed by rich pollen horizons, followed by animal bones, followed by silence, and then another band of charcoal laid decades or centuries later. These are not random scars of lightning or war. They are intervals, intentions, evidence that fire was used as rhythm, and that rhythm shaped more than food. It shaped movement. Smoke could travel farther than a shout. A thin column rising at dawn could signal to distant kin. We have returned to the valley. There is forage. There will be meat. In the Great Basin, in the plateaus near the Mojave, in the uplands skirting Death Valley itself, there are oral traditions of smoke becoming navigation, a language used in migration seasons when camps split and spread like fingers across the land. They followed not rivers, they followed signals written in the morning light. Fire also taught them timing, not just when to burn, but where never to. Sacred springs were protected. Mesquite groves that fed generations were left unburned. Cattail marshes were spared until the final days of winter, when ice thinned but new shoots had not yet formed. Their knowledge was not random. It was inherited, memorized in stories, practiced through observation, refined through loss. But fire wasn't perfect. It could still turn against them. There are hints of this in the archaeological record. A campsite buried beneath thick ash where wind likely shifted suddenly. Obsidian flakes melted at the edges from intense heat. Bones half charred in what appears not to be ritual but accident. Fire, though guided, was never owned. To use it required patience. To misuse it required only one moment of wind. This is why the act of lighting a fire was rarely done alone. One would ignite. Another would watch the sky. Another would clear brush into rough semicircles. They read the air like scripture, feeling humidity with the back of their hands, watching for the way smoke bent against an unseen breeze. If it leaned too far, too fast, they stopped. If it rose straight, they continued. In this way, fire became more than tool. It became teacher. It taught responsibility. It taught restraint. It taught them that power is never a thing you hold. It is a thing you borrow. And always, when the flames died, they stayed to watch the embers cool, not out of fear, but out of respect. Because the land remembers what you burn, and it remembers why. Now, only one question remains. If fire could be wielded with such care, what other forces might be guided next? This question did not arise all at once. It crept in slowly, like smoke threading through canyon passes. With each generation, the people began to understand that their role was not to conquer the desert, but to be in continual conversation with it. Fire was only the beginning. What followed was a way of life tuned to nuance, to temperatures that rose by half a degree, to the scent of ozone before rain, to the way birdsong shifted when the land was about to turn dry. And fire remained the loudest whisper in their toolkit. It shaped the very stories they told. In tradition still remembered among the descendants of these early desert dwellers, fire is not just warmth or survival. It is a relative, a spirit to be spoken to, not commanded. It is often called the walker because it moves like a person, forward with intention, hesitant at edges, quickened by breath. In places like the Black Rock Desert and Owens Valley, oral traditions tell of fire that went out of control only when disrespected, when set carelessly or in arrogance or without prayer. These were not just accidents, they were breaches of relationship. Because fire, like all powerful things, asked for humility. In our modern age, we tend to think of fire either as catastrophe or as symbol, a threat to forests, a tool of war, a flickering metaphor for passion or rage. But to the ancestors of the American Southwest, it was none of these. Fire was part of a system of understanding. It was the answer to a question first whispered by the land when the water disappeared. Will you adapt, or will you perish? They chose to adapt, not with technology as we define it, but with awareness, with rhythm, with a way of seeing the world not as a resource to be extracted, but as a companion in survival. Controlled burns, timed migrations, the planting of seeds in recently scorched soil, these were not isolated strategies. They were part of a worldview in which no act was meaningless. Every ember carried memory. Every trail of smoke was a message, and every fire lit with intention was a statement of trust, that life would return if given the space to grow. So we return now to that image at dawn, a figure kneeling beside the brittle brush, the bundle of sage in hand, a spark born from stone. The fire begins, it walks forward, not to devour but to reveal. the land opens in response. Not in fear, but in recognition. They were not masters of the desert. They were its students, its messengers, its stewards. And by learning to burn without destruction, to ignite without conquest, they etched into the memory of the land a different kind of history, one not built on monuments or ruins, but on ashes, rebirth, and the quiet wisdom of those who listened before they acted. In fire, they did not find dominion. They found belonging. They found rivers underground, buried beneath silence, sealed beneath centuries of thirst. By the time the deserts had fully revealed themselves, when heat ruled the midday hours and silence claimed the dusk, those who wandered the Mojave were no longer looking for streams or springs in plain sight. They had learned, through the long instruction of desperation, that water hides, that survival belonged not to those who searched the horizon, but to those who could listen downward, to those who could see with their feet. Beneath the cracked crust of ancient playas and salt-crusted basins, far below the illusion of lifelessness, slumbered the remnants of an older world. Vast carbonate aquifers, born during wetter epochs when lakes stretched to the mountains and storms flowed freely through the Great Basin. These aquifers, buried and pressurized, held the memory of abundance in subterranean veins, but they did not give their secrets willingly. The land did not advertise its generosity. What kind of mind begins to understand that the earth has arteries? That water, like memory, moves even when unseen? The Mojave's carbonate aquifers stretch in lattices beneath mountain ranges and dry valleys, holding not rivers as we imagine them, but webs of slow-moving, mineral-rich trickles. Water infused with ancient calcium and filtered through millennia of limestone. And it was here, in the deepest silence of the southwest, that small scattered bands of humans became cartographers of the invisible. In the shimmering basins where no stream had flowed in living memory, the people learned to read the subtle language of the land. A wind-carved notch in the stone, the salt bloom curling at the base of a cliff, the way a lizard's belly pressed against a patch of slightly cooler sand. These were signs, not coincidences. The world spoke in patterns, and if one listened with stillness and respect, it could be understood. Why would anyone remain in a land where water vanishes into the air before it reaches your lips? Because to stay was to become something else, to become myth, to become part of the place itself. Over time, their movements grew precise, not aimless wandering, but inherited pilgrimage. Children were shown where the wind changed flavour, how it carried the ghost of moisture when it passed over buried springs. Elders knelt beside cracked stones and waited for the sun to rise at just the right angle, to cast the faintest glint on the edge of selenite, signalling where groundwater once kissed the surface. The desert was not empty. It was encoded. Every dune, every rockfall, every pale crust of ancient lake bed was a page from a buried manuscript. And those who knew how to read it became authors of their own survival. But how do you preserve meaning when even water becomes invisible? You leave marks not in words but in stone, not for the gods but for each other. And so began the second language of the desert, a language not spoken aloud but carved where no wind could erase it. Petroglyphs, etched into basalt cliffs, varnished by time, glowing dark under the sun, were not just art, nor prayers cast into stone. They were instructions, warnings, maps. They told of water, not gods. Circles marked springs. Spirals traced the long path of water underground, following pressure lines through ancient limestone. Lines carved like ripples were not metaphors. They were directions, pointing towards seepages so faint you would miss them if you arrived after noon. To the unknowing, these engravings appear abstract, shapes adrift in time. But to those who walked the land with their ears pressed to the wind, every mark had weight. A horizontal line dotted at intervals might speak of seasonal pools, full in spring, gone by midsummer. A handprint carved beside it might signify permission or warning. Some hands were smaller, perhaps belonging to children, placed not to say I was here, but remember this place exists. Even boulders became books. On sun-blackened rock, long parallel grooves marked the ascent to ridge springs, where water bled from fractured stone after rare storms. Certain symbols repeated across vast distances, from the Panamint Range to the Amargosa Valley, suggesting a network of memory carried by feet, preserved by hands. But petroglyphs alone could not quench thirst, and so the land offered other clues, ones not etched in stone but embedded in sensation. A sudden coolness underfoot meant moisture close to the surface. The scent of creosote after rain, sharp, electric, meant water vapour was rising from below. But the most subtle signs came from the earth itself, the softness of clay beneath cracked salt flats, the shine of selenite crystals blooming like frost inside limestone caverns. These selenite veins, translucent, pale as bone, formed where ancient groundwater once evaporated, leaving behind its mineral skeleton. Find selenite, brushed by breath dampness, and you were close. Elders placed their palms against cavern walls, not to pray, but to feel. If the stone was cool, not cold, but cool, you dug. If it was dry and warm, you moved on. Those who found water were not celebrated with song or carved into legend. Instead, they became mystery, wanderers who moved between camps neither fully belonging nor entirely apart. Some say they carried staffs tipped with turquoise, others that they wore necklaces of polished gypsum. The truth is quieter. They likely travelled with nothing but memory, moving with the stars and returning with water. People whispered about them around fires, not because they commanded awe, but because they asked nothing in return. They would approach a dying camp, offer a route to a spring hidden beneath volcanic rock, and disappear before dawn. They did not find water, they remembered it, and that is the essence of this chapter. Beneath cracked salt, beneath the illusion of lifelessness, lie rivers made not of water alone, but of knowledge. Knowledge carried not in books, but in footsteps, not in temples, but in silence. And deeper still, beneath stone and memory, lies something stranger, the breath of rivers so old no map recalls them. To find these lost waters was not merely a feat of observation, it was an act of reverence. The ancients did not speak of owning water, such language would have seemed absurd. Water belonged to itself. You could borrow its presence, you could follow its hints, but to try and command it, that was how you vanished into the salt. Instead, the people turned to the land's oldest allies, the animals. Desert bighorns and kit foxes were not just prey or predators, they were messengers. The sharp turn of a deer's ear could indicate a seep hidden among boulders. The looping trail of a fox often curved, not at random, but toward cooler air rising from a shaded spring. Even the insects gave clues. In the dead hours of summer, where no plants bloomed, sudden flurries of gnats marked humidity before it reached the skin. The humans were watching, not dominating, just listening. And the most mythic figures, those remembered even in modern tribal oral traditions, were said to follow not just signs, but something subtler still, the breath of the earth itself. They placed their faces close to the ground at dawn, when thermals were still. If the scent of minerals and moisture rose faintly, like steam through a cave, they would mark the spot. These scouts were not spiritualists in the modern sense. They were practitioners of something deeper, observational intimacy, and when they found it, true drinkable water hidden beneath months of dust and sun, they did not exploit it, they protected it. Sometimes they concealed its location with false markers, zigzag stones meant to confuse anyone unfamiliar with their language. Sometimes they covered the seep with brush, leaving only the faintest indication for those who had been taught where to look, because water was not simply hydration, it was a trust. And just as the people mapped the land through movement, they began to map their stories through the geography of moisture. A myth might begin at a mountain pass and end at a spring that only flowed once a decade. Ceremonies were held where water once emerged, not necessarily because it still did, but because memory remained there, like a dried riverbed after rain. Even today, hydrologists tracing ancient aquifers in the Mojavean Great Basin find archaeological traces, charcoal clusters, shell beads, split agave husks near fossil springs. These sites show no evidence of permanent settlement, just visitation, reverence, the kind of silence you bring only to sacred places. It is a strange kind of intimacy. To know a land not by what it gives, but by what it almost withholds. To know water not by its presence, but by its absence. And in this way, the hidden rivers carved not just stone, but culture. Their absence shaped migration, their promise shaped myth, and their memory shaped people. For in the desert, what you do not see is often the most real thing of all. And so it was that knowledge itself became a form of water, circulated, protected, passed down, not hoarded but guarded. In this way, an entire epistemology emerged shaped not by conquest but by care. Knowing where to find hidden water was more than a survival skill. It was a responsibility that stretched across generations. Among the rock shelters and shade canopies of what we now call the Great Basin, elders began to teach a language of place. This language had no written script and no single dialect. It was spoken through gestures, through time spent walking together, and most of all, through silence. A child would not be told where the water was. They would be taken there slowly, again and again, until they could feel the subtle dip in humidity, the change in bird patterns, the feel of cooler air behind a sunlit rock. The knowledge was absorbed into the body like heat through skin. And if the child learned, not only how to find water, but how to know when not to go looking, when to let the land recover, they had become part of a lineage more important than blood, the lineage of those who listened well. From a modern lens, this can be hard to comprehend. Our technologies aim to extract, to quantify, to control, but here water was not managed, it was anticipated. You did not take from it unless it allowed you. You waited, and waiting became a virtue, a science, a theology. This sensitivity extended to everything. The same people who learned to find springs through the scent of creosote also knew which rocks cracked underfoot and which muffled sound. They knew which plant roots could be crushed for a few sips of bitter moisture, and which would poison you slowly. They knew that where gypsum dust rose in the afternoon, no fresh water had passed for decades. Even the winds were informants. Breezes that passed over wet ground carried cooler scents and fewer particulates. By holding a wetted finger aloft, or simply standing still with eyes closed, travellers could tell which direction held the higher chance of water, not certainty, just a little more chance. And that was often enough. In some places, the knowledge of hidden rivers became ritualized. Travellers left carved stone markers not for themselves, but for those who might follow. A pile of rocks with a hole punched through the centre, a water eye, meant something lived below. A spiral etched beside it might mean it only flowed in spring. These signs became the first shared texts of the desert, open to all who could interpret them. Yet the most sacred places were never marked. They lived in the breath of stories, the kind told only at night, passed from mouth to ear, wrapped in a metaphor. In those stories, water flowed through stone like light through bone, and the land listened as much as it gave. And perhaps the strangest part is this. Those rivers are still there, hidden, waiting, alive in silence. In the modern Mojave, beneath highways and test sites, under wind farms and shuttered ghost towns, ancient aquifers still run, deep, slow, and unreachable by anything but time. Some are fossil water, sealed beneath impermeable stone since before humans arrived. Others still breathe faintly, pushing small pulses toward forgotten springs after distant mountain rains. Geologists trace them with satellite imaging now. Machines estimate their depths. Wells are drilled, pipes are laid. And yet there are places, quiet, unclaimed, where no survey equipment will ever find what the old people knew. Places where water seeps not for profit but for patience, where a spring flows only if approached with care. We like to think of prehistory as a time of raw survival, a blur of crude tools and desperate hunger. But here, in the deepest deserts of ancient America, we see something else entirely, a philosophy, not written down, not debated, but lived. A way of thinking in which absence was not void, but teacher. Where life was designed not to push back against the land, but to step gently into its rhythm. A worldview in which thirst was not a failure, but a form of attention. And water, not a right, but a relationship. You can still see it in the petroglyphs if you know how to look. You can feel it in the hush that falls in certain canyons just before dawn, when the stars are still burning low and the heat has not yet arrived. In that space, it is possible to imagine the ones who walked here first, kneeling beside a patch of earth that felt just a little too cool, whispering to the stone, listening, remembering. Because that's what it means to survive 130 degrees without water. It means not just outlasting the heat, but understanding what it asks of you. It means carrying maps that are not made of paper, but of memory. It means knowing how to look up at a night sky and read where the springs lie, by the tilt of the constellations and the slope of the land. It means watching the way a raven circles low over a canyon floor, not because it hunts, but because it waits for the shimmer of moisture the humans have not yet seen. This chapter closes not with triumph, but with quiet. A spring still trickles under volcanic stone, its sound nearly indistinguishable from silence. And nearby, a footprint rests in the dust, not fresh, not ancient, just present. A reminder that to endure a landscape like this is not to conquer it, but to become fluent in its silences, to become part of the hidden river, and to drink not only from water but from memory. The journey continues, but here, for a moment, we rest. We rest in the quiet breath beneath the sun, not the kind carved into stone or drawn onto bark, but the kind carried in silence, passed from one voice to another, from one footfall to the next. Across the Great Basin and beyond, long before nations, before maps, before even the idea of permanence, there were trails carved into time by thirst and fire, not straight, not planned, but remembered, routes that followed the logic of absence, the wisdom of knowing where water was not, and the near-miraculous art of finding where it might be. 10,000 years. That is how long human beings have been crossing the interior of North America, not in conquest, but in continuity. And across that span, through the rise and fall of lakes, through the silencing of rivers, through heat that peeled the skin from stone, one truth remained. Survival was not about possession, but passage. The old ones, the early peoples of the Great Basin, were never still. We do not know what they called themselves, or what names they gave to the dunes that moved like breathing creatures, or to the hills that whispered winds across cracked salt flats. But we know they moved. Not aimlessly, not blindly, but with purpose guided by memory older than their own. They would become the ancestors of the Numu, the Shoshone, the Paiute, the voices that still echo in the land if you listen carefully enough. Their migrations were not random wanderings, but deliberate crossings, calibrated over generations, each leg a lesson embedded in flesh, fire, and sky. What happens to a culture when it is shaped not by abundance but by necessity? The answer is written in the earth. At the mouths of dried springs and beside the fossilized footprints of camels and mammoths, we find caches of tools, scattered beads, discarded hearths, breadcrumbs in the sand. These are not ruins in the traditional sense. There are no monuments, no city walls. The monuments are the distances crossed. The cities are the relationships held in motion. Community becomes a verb, not a place. And along these routes something astonishing appears. Shells. Tiny, polished, disc-shaped shells, pierced with careful holes, worn smooth by finger and time. They come from the ocean. The Pacific, hundreds of miles to the west, beyond mountains, beyond valleys, beyond everything that once seemed impassable. How did they get here? Who carried them? And more importantly, why? Trade, perhaps, but not in the way modern minds understand it. This was not a market economy. It was a ritual of connection, a ceremony of recognition across vast, thirsty distances. To pass a shell from one hand to another was to pass a piece of the ocean itself into the heart of the desert. A promise, a reminder, a story. Because stories, like rivers, only survive if they are kept moving. And what are these shell beads, if not words made visible? Syllables of salt and time threaded into the fabric of memory. What else might they have carried? Because a shell is not just an ornament. In a land where everything is weighed against survival, nothing useless survives long. These beads, olivella shells, abalone fragments, sometimes even pieces of mother of pearl were more than decoration. They were proof of distance conquered, of kinships maintained, of pathways still open through an increasingly hostile world. They were water turned into memory. Archaeologists uncover them in caves and rock shelters far from any sea. Spirit Cave, Lovelock Cave, Tool Springs, Hog Up Cave. Places where no tide has ever touched, yet still the ocean lingers. Some beads are worn into necklaces, others bundled beside the dead, placed near the heart or clenched in a silent fist. A symbol, perhaps, of journeys made, or journeys yet to come. Their presence reveals something profound. Even as lakes dried and rivers vanished, people did not fragment into isolation. Instead, they connected more tightly. They followed threads of stone and silence to exchange not only goods, obsidian, ochre, salt, shells, but knowledge, where the spring still flowed, where the herds still roamed, where the storms still broke against distant mountains. Routes formed, not roads, not trails, but memory corridors. Oral maps carried in songs and cadences of footsteps, in the pauses between words. The ancient Shoshone, Numic-speaking peoples whose ancestors walked these same desert seas, had no need for parchment or ink. Their maps were living, breathing things, recited at night beside low fires, taught to children while their shadows danced on basalt walls. A direction might be spoken as a story. Walk where the rabbit brush leans in the evening wind. When the black rock rises like the spine of a sleeping animal, turn your face to the place where the sun dies. Walk until the stars form the shape of the coyote's eye. There, the water sleeps beneath the stones. This was not poetry, it was infrastructure. Oral tradition functioning as a survival algorithm. Memory sharpened into cartography. Stories became both compass and ancestor. We often imagine infrastructure as things we can touch. Aqueducts, roads, reservoirs. Yet in this world, infrastructure was intangible. It moved as people moved. It was stored not in stone, but in synapses. It required no tools, only trust. To forget, then, was not merely ignorance. It was death. And so families, clans, entire migrating bands became walking archives of climate, season and soil. When someone died, their memories, their portion of the vast map, were not just mourned. They were urgently preserved. Others would sit beside them in their final hours, listening as they recited the locations of springs, the timing of migrations, the old names of mountains. Some of those names survive today, passed through languages shifted by time, but still echoing the first meaning. Place where water returns, valley of bitter salt, hill of twice-burned grass. All of this, shell beads, stories as maps, memory as infrastructure, formed a network older than any kingdom. The 10,000-year crossing was not a line through space. It was a braid of footsteps, myth and thirst, moving through time. And in this weaving, every element played a role, not just water, not just trade, but story. Stories became the roads no wind could erase. A tale passed to a child at dusk became, generations later, the very thread that guided their descendants across parched lands to safety. The desert in its silence demanded precision, and precision came through repetition. There were no written books, no engraved laws, but there was law, the law of story. Tell it the same each time, or someone dies. The tradition wasn't just artistic, it was algorithmic. A story of a coyote tricking a mountain spirit could encode the location of a seasonal spring. A myth about a lost woman whose tears turn to salt might mark a briny patch of earth that kills if drunk. Even the stars were enlisted, Orion not just as a hunter, but as a calendar. The rise of Sirius as signal, time to move. The Shoshone and Paiute, inheritors of these patterns, remember this. Their oral traditions stretch back farther than most written languages, mapping not only events but ecosystems. They describe water that moves underground like a living creature. They recall how juniper berries ripen in cycles that sync with bighorn sheep migrations. They speak of pathways across salt flats that only reveal themselves after high winds. This is what it means to make memory your infrastructure. Not only do you store information, you perform it. Families became performance troupes of survival. The elder who knows the stars, the youth who watches the ravens, the aunt who hears wind through creosote and knows when rain last fell. Each person a part of a living library, with roles to rehearse, lessons to recite, cadences to remember. Anthropologists have long puzzled over how such vast distances were reliably traversed in a time before compasses, before maps. But the answer is less mysterious when seen through the lens of ritual. Each year, seasonal gatherings, precursors to trade fairs, allowed different groups to exchange goods and stories. Not just for wealth, but for recalibration, to refresh the oral maps, to update the routes, to cross-check what the stars whispered against what the rivers actually did. A kind of prehistoric network update, maintained not by servers, but by song. And within these networks, shell beads passed again, passed from someone who had seen the ocean to someone who had never heard its roar. From hands wet with coastal fog to hands cracked by sun-bleached dunes. The shell became proof not only of where you came from, but of where you could go, a credential, a token, a piece of a larger whole. Even now, when these beads are excavated from the desert floor, they seem to hum faintly with the memory of a movement, of exchange, of trust. Because for 10,000 years, survival was not about standing still. It was about remembering how to move together. Because in the desert, knowledge is not optional. It's not a luxury you carry. It's the water you walk with. And in a place where maps could not be drawn, where landmarks shifted in wind and sand, it was the act of remembering in common that kept people alive. Consider the trails etched into the memory of the Great Basin, the barest thread between mountains, through arroyos, into dry valleys that once shimmered with glacial meltwater. These were not the straight stone roads of Roman engineers, but something subtler, adaptive, responsive, guided not by tools but by pulse. When one spring failed, an alternate trail emerged. When the wind changed, people adjusted not just their route but their rhythm. And into this choreography came language, not just spoken, but gestural. Hand signs passed across ridgelines. Songs hummed just above hearing to avoid startling prey. Signal fires lit from high places, their smoke spiralling into stories across distances too great for voice. The early Shoshone developed an intricate lexicon of such movement. They could read the angle of cracked clay to know how long a spring had slept. They could taste the bitterness of certain plants and know how recently bighorn had passed. They could follow the silence of birds to avoid predators, or other bands. Their expertise was not in conquering the land, but in reading it. And reading it not as an enemy, but as a collaborator. This is a difficult idea for the modern mind, raised on narratives of dominance over nature. But in the 10,000-year crossing, dominance was a death wish. Those who pushed too far without listening, who clung to memory without adapting it, who ignored the quiet clues left by the wind and the beetle and the scent of baked stone, those are the people whose tools we find buried in abandoned encampments, their bones sun-bleached beside forgotten paths. But those who listened, they became myth. Their stories echo not just in language, but in landscape. Take the story of the woman who turned into stone because she drank too much too quickly after finding a hidden spring. It's a cautionary tale, yes, but also a map passed down through metaphor. Her stone body lies at a real outcropping. The lesson is physiological too. Don't shock your system with cold water after heatstroke. It's folklore as first aid. Or the tale of the boy who followed a coyote into a salt flat and vanished, his footprints ending in a spiral. The elders say it means never follow a coyote without knowing the winds, but archaeologists have traced such spirals to mirages near Dead Valley. The boy, it seems, chased a reflection. These stories are not merely art. They are evolved mechanisms, narrative GPS, ecological algorithms, mnemonic shelters. Each one recited again and again, reshaped but never unmoored, because accuracy wasn't optional. To misremember could mean misstep. And in a world where one wrong step meant the end, stories became the truest measure of distance. They became waypoints not marked on stone but engraved in breath. Every retelling was a recalibration, a reminder of where the living still walked and where only ghosts remained. Over time, these story maps became more than tools, they became identity. You were not just of a family or a band. You were of a route, of a circuit across the desert that your ancestors had known, and your descendants would inherit. Among the old ones, and later among the Western Shoshone and Goshute peoples, identity was woven into mobility. To be static was to be severed. You carried the knowledge of springs the way others might carry a family name. Something inherited, yes, but also protected, tended, passed along not with pride but with care. And so the 10,000-year crossing was not a journey with an end. It was continuity. The act of walking became the act of remembering. The act of remembering became the act of surviving. And surviving became a kind of quiet reverence, a spiritual technology that asked not for dominance over the land, but participation within it. Even today, along some of these ancient routes, you can see remnants of this living archive. Shell beads still turn up in dry lake beds hundreds of miles from any coastline. Flint from far-off mountains lies beside hearths made from local stone. Petroglyphs mark not just the presence of people, but the reliability of a spring, the passage of animals, the return of a season. To modernize these artifacts seems scattered, like fragments of a lost world, but they are not scattered. They are strung along invisible threads, the memory routes, the oral roads, the braided lifelines of a people who refuse to forget. And within those threads are codes we're only just beginning to understand. Not codes of conquest or empire, but codes of kinship. A bead, after all, is not just currency, it's trust embodied. To receive one was to be welcomed. To offer one was to say, I know the story, I know the route, I come in peace and thirst. In this way, the desert became a cathedral of memory. Every whisper of wind over sand, every hush between footfalls was part of the ongoing liturgy. And the people who walked there were not just migrants. They were caretakers of something deeper than terrain. They were the living keepers of a map that could not be drawn, only told. The 10,000-year crossing continues still, not in the dust-covered footsteps, but in the enduring human instinct to remember the land with our bodies, to feel our way through silence, to store direction in story, to pass a single shell from hand to hand across generations, and so, even now, beneath highways and fences again, the old routes remain, waiting to be remembered, waiting to be walked again. Under a sky so clear it seemed cruel, a silence once reserved for sacred places began to stretch across the American Southwest. The earth had hardened, its clay skin cracked open in vast geometric webs, exposing the thirst below. Winds moved without mercy, lifting powdered salt from ancient lake beds, scouring the bones of forgotten waters. In this dry cathedral of light and heat, temperatures began to climb to levels modern minds still flinch to imagine. 130 degrees beneath an open sun, not the heat of summer, but the heat of collapse. What happens to a people when the sky itself turns against them? Between 6,000 and 4,000 years ago, the climate turned, not with sudden violence, but with a slow tightening, an invisible hand closing around the throat of an entire landscape. This was not merely a drought, it was a reckoning. Paleo-ecological records from sediment cores and pollen traces confirm what oral stories have long hinted. Lakes that had persisted for thousands of years vanished within generations. Marshes turned to alkali crusts. Hills that once wore soft canopies of sage and willow were stripped bare by the sun's unblinking stare. Where water once pooled, only mirages remained, and the people, those resilient, observant wanderers who had survived by learning the land's patterns, found themselves adrift in a world where the patterns no longer held. What compass guides you when the rivers forget their names? Archaeological sites from this era whisper the tale with haunting consistency. Settlements abandoned amid construction. Hearths still holding ash, as if someone had planned to return. Footprints pressed into hardened mud, leading away with no indication of where they end. These were not the movements of conquest or expansion. These were the absences of retreat. In White Sands, New Mexico, fossilized human footprints cross paths with those of mammoths and giant ground sloths, embedded in what was once the edge of a vast, nourishing lake. But by the height of this drought, the lake was gone, and so too were the megafauna. The people who remained did not leave monuments, they left traces. A child's heel pressed into baked mud, the heel of an elder dragging just slightly more than the rest. Traces of desperation or discipline. How do you read the intention behind a single step? Some walked until their shadows vanished beneath them. Some waited beside dry wells, their offerings piled in hope rather than confidence. In Owens Valley and the Great Basin, archaeologists have uncovered stone circles where people once sang to the clouds, songs that may never have been answered. These were not superstitions in the modern sense. These were technologies of grief. When the land offers no sign, it is the voice that must fill the void, but even hope leaves fingerprints. Charcoal found in long-dead wetlands tells us that people lit fires near the shores of evaporating lakes, not to burn the land, but to call something back: growth, moisture, balance. What happens when fire becomes a prayer? When breath itself becomes a sacrifice to the wind? And through it all, stories endured. In oral traditions that span tribes and centuries, there are repeated images of the sun becoming too bright, of days stretching unnaturally long, of animals walking toward the horizon and never returning. These are not mere metaphors. They are the memory of climates once lived through, encoded in myth to survive the forgetting. How do you hold on to meaning when the world begins to melt beneath your feet? Those who stayed did not do so out of ignorance. They did so with full awareness of the odds. The desert, in its cruelty, also teaches a clarity no lush forest can offer. Every step is a question, every breath a calculation, and in that equation they wrote themselves in, not as conquerors, not even as survivors, but as participants in a dialogue too ancient to name. Because what does it mean to belong to a land that does not want you? What does it mean to wait for a sky that will not weep? What does it mean to keep walking? The footprints tell us they did. They walked through heat so intense it blurred the edges of reality, where the air shimmered not from magic but from suffering. What was once a familiar rhythm of seasonal droughts had escalated into an unfamiliar and relentless trial. The sun no longer moved through the sky like a companion, but hung above like a tormentor, unyielding and eternal. Shadows shrank and disappeared. Water became not just scarce but mythical, and still they walked. This was not a single drought, but an epical convulsion. Paleo-environmental data tells us that between 6,000 and 4,000 years ago, the Holocene thermal maximum scorched the American Southwest. The Mojave, the Sonoran, the Great Basin, each bore different names, but the same fate. Springs that had sustained life for generations were swallowed by silence. Playa lakes evaporated to nothing. Swamps and marshes became brittle illusions, the ghost memories of once lush sanctuaries. Tree-ring data and pack-rat middens trace this collapse with mathematical precision. But those metrics are cold compared to the evidence found in the ground, footprints left mid-journey. In central Nevada, settlements from this era show evidence of rapid abandonment. Storage pits, once lined with stone and filled with seeds, were left exposed. Grinding stones used to process mesquite pods and cattail roots sit beside empty fire pits. Tools placed down but never reclaimed. In some caves, layers of ash and plant residue abruptly stop, replaced by layers of wind-blown sand. Entire valleys went quiet. We often imagine human migration as conquest or ambition, but here it was surrender, a calculated, sorrowful recognition that staying would mean death. And so families moved, not toward a promise, but away from collapse. Some travelled eastward, seeking higher altitudes. Others ventured north, hoping for cooler shade beneath juniper forests. But even those paths grew hostile. The high deserts offered only wind, and the wind offered no mercy. And yet, amid the abandonment, there were signs of ritual. Offerings left beside dry lake beds, carefully arranged stones, bundles of burned sage, tiny effigies carved from bone and softened wood. At the ancient playa of Owens Lake, archaeologists discovered clusters of charred fish bones, not evidence of recent meals, but of memory. Fish had not swum there for centuries by then. The people were not cooking. They were remembering. Some of the most haunting clues come not from what was left behind, but from how it was left. At several sites, objects were placed gently into the earth, grinding stones buried with care as if to say, "You will be needed again." This was not abandonment without hope. It was a kind of suspended dialogue with the land. A pause, not a farewell. And then there are the songs. Indigenous oral traditions that persist today speak of clouds that once listened. of winds that carried messages, of animals that withdrew not in fear but in mourning. These stories are not fictions, they are preservations of memory, coded in metaphor but rooted in observation. When the sky failed, people sang to it. When the rains vanished, voices rose to replace them. These were not hymns of desperation, they were songs of negotiation. Because if the sky had closed, perhaps a song could open it again. This was the quiet rebellion of those who refused to forget. In the harshest stretches of the drought, when all familiar waterlines had receded, and the heat seared not only skin but spirit, the people turned inward, to memory, to tradition, to the careful inheritance of knowledge passed voice to voice in the hush between stars. They could not force the rains to return, but they could remember where they had once fallen. In the absence of flowing water, survival became an act of precision. In the driest corners of the Mojave, archaeological remains from this period show traces of camps established not around visible water sources, but near geological features that suggested hidden reserves, dry washes, collapsed cave roofs, shady alcoves where condensation might collect on stone. Tools recovered from these sites reflect this shift in strategy, not weapons of conquest, but implements of delicate extraction, digging sticks, small stone scoops, and woven fibre ropes. Water, now mythic in its scarcity, was not only sought but tracked with a kind of reverence. Observers began to follow the behaviour of animals with renewed attention. The erratic paths of deer, the sudden gathering of insects, the low calls of birds at dawn, each became a line in a poem too old for writing. Even the wind itself was studied for scent and temperature, as some began to notice that a faint coolness or the whisper of damp creosote on the breeze might signal a hidden seep nearby. And as settlements broke apart, new routes formed, not the wide, worn roads of trade caravans, but a network of ephemeral trails, remembered in footfall and whispered in song. These were not etched into stone or sketched onto bark. They lived in the minds of those who walked them. This was infrastructure not of roads, but of recollection. In this time, the landscape itself became a kind of script, and its grammar was silence. Rock faces that once bore depictions of game or ceremonial figures began to display simpler, more urgent messages. Spirals beside dry gullies, concentric rings above ancient seeps. Petroglyphs from this era, stark and spare, likely served not only spiritual purposes but practical ones. These were water maps in the language of stone, symbols carried by generations of walkers, remembered and re-remembered each time they passed. Yet even in this austerity, moments of beauty persisted. Shell beads, some traced to the Pacific coast, continued to appear in inland caches. They were not used as currency in a world stripped bare of excess. They were gifts, perhaps traded during rare meetings between bands, tokens that said, "We are still here. You are not alone." Such gestures remind us that in the depths of collapse, community did not vanish. It adapted. Gatherings likely became smaller, shorter, more secretive, but they endured. People still met under desert stars to share stories. Born of dry passes, teach the young how to find moisture where none was visible. In this time, knowing became the highest form of wealth. A memory could save a life. A well-timed word could mean the difference between thirst and survival. And so, even as the sky refused to yield, the people did not stop speaking to it. They offered not complaints but conversations, rituals that were less about bending nature to their will and more about aligning their lives with the rhythms of a place that no longer offered comfort. In many ways, this was the turning point in the 10,000-year struggle. Not the hottest moment, not the driest, but the spiritual reckoning, the understanding that they were not simply surviving in a desert, they were now of it. At playa lakes such as Soda Lake and ancient dry basins near Death Valley, archaeological teams have found peculiar arrangements of stones, carefully laid arcs, spirals and parallel rows. Some believe these were celestial markers used to track solstices and equinoxes, but others suggest a more immediate earthbound purpose. These may have been ritual spaces, meant to align not with the stars but with the land's moods. Offerings were left here, scraps of fibre, pigment-stained pebbles, bones of small animals, each arranged with quiet intention. These weren't large, dramatic displays. They were subtle, private conversations with the earth. Songs were sung in these places, whispered, likely, or perhaps chanted low enough to not startle the dust. They were laments, but also lullabies, ways of soothing a land grown cruel, coaxing rain from the silence. Some traditions that survive among descendant indigenous cultures still include songs offered not to clouds but to empty skies. They remember the sky as something that once listened. It's easy to imagine that hope would have been extinguished during these centuries of relentless drought. But what emerges from the archaeological and oral record is not despair, but transformation. In their lowest moment, people became not victims of the climate, but interpreters of it. They began to live through the drought, not just against it, and that shift in perspective may be what ensured their survival. A footprint found in mid-stride, a grinding stone buried gently beside a dying spring, a song passed to a child. These were the technologies of endurance. They didn't look like shelters or weapons. They looked like patience. Communities began to time their movements to a finer rhythm. Rather than wandering blindly, they waited for subtle cues. A rare cloudburst 100 miles away might send its pulse through dry riverbeds days later. Those who knew where to stand might catch the first taste of it. The sound of frogs at night, long absent, might signal the return of a seep. One could not live fast in this world. Only the still and the attentive could read its signals. The desert became a library. Every cracked stone and evaporated waterline held information. To the untrained eye, it was all monotony, beige and barren. But to those who had just suffered within it, the land was as legible as any scroll. They read the bends in arroyos, the behaviour of birds, the way certain plants curved toward buried moisture. And over time, this knowledge became more than survival. It became identity. To live in a world where the sun could kill you by mid-morning was not merely a challenge, it was a shaping force. It carved the body into lean efficiency, yes, but it also etched new patterns into the mind. Memory, attentiveness, ritual, these became the architecture of life. And so, when we say these were some of the hottest centuries ever endured by prehistoric Americans, we're not only talking about temperature, we're talking about the heat of transformation, 130 degrees. That number now appears in climatological reconstructions and sediment cores, in pollen records and isotope analysis. It's not just a speculative figure, it's a threshold, a reality that entire generations pass through without the things we imagine necessary. No air conditioning, no wells drilled deep into the aquifer, no imported food, just stone, bone, fibre, and memory. And yet, they stayed. This is what echoes most powerfully through the archaeological record. Not the collapse, but the continuity. Even as some settlements were abandoned and routes rerouted, even as rains failed and rivers vanished, the story does not end in extinction. It persists in adjustment. Human beings did not leave the desert. They became it. In certain petroglyph panels found near long dry springs, figures begin to change during this period. Earlier motifs depict people in active poses, hunters, dancers, animals in flight. But during the height of the drought, some panels shift. The figures are still, seated, faces lifted toward the sky, hands open. Some archaeologists interpret these as religious icons, but perhaps they are something else. Moments of pause, of attention, of listening. A visual record of the people learning to wait, to watch, to be in rhythm with an environment that no longer offered certainty. Even today, among the descendant communities of the Southwest, stories persist from this long drought. They are not always framed as history. Sometimes they come as cautionary tales or origin myths, or fragments woven into seasonal songs. But the essence remains, the knowledge that the land is not guaranteed, that even the sky can close, and that survival is not always about fighting, but about adapting the soul to new shapes. By the end of this chapter in the prehistoric American story, the land had become something new. The great inland seas were gone, the megafauna were memories, even the air itself had changed, less humid, more filled with dust and sun. But the people remained. They had learned to treat time as a landscape, just as shifting and vast as the one under their feet. They had made offerings to silence and sung to an absent sky. And when the rains finally came again, In years or in generations, the people who greeted them were not the same. They were leaner, wiser, and somehow more deeply rooted than ever before. Because once you've lived through the closing of the sky, you know how to live with your eyes open to everything. They did not conquer the desert, they absorbed it. As the long droughts of centuries stretched into tradition, the people who remained in the heart of fire did not escape the sun's domain. They moved differently, thought differently, ate differently, and perhaps most importantly, believed differently. For those who stayed, survival became not an act of resistance, but an act of deep listening. The silence of the desert was not empty. It spoke in root patterns and wind songs, in the curled edge of a leaf or the colour of a distant hill at dusk. And those who endured the worst heat the earth could offer did so not by overcoming the land, but by becoming part of it. How do you grow water? It's not a riddle, it's a survival strategy. Where surface water failed and the rains arrived like forgotten promises, people turned to plants that held moisture in their bones. Agave, the thick-fleshed sentinel of the drylands, became more than food. It was memory. It could be roasted, pounded, fermented, its roots yielding sugar, its fibres woven into rope and sandals, and most critically it could be cultivated. The people of the early Holocene did not stumble upon this truth by accident. They watched, tracked the blooms across seasons, and learned which hillsides held the right sunlight, which slopes would cradle morning mist. Some varieties of agave took decades to mature, but the wait was understood as part of the rhythm, not an inconvenience. Patience became technology. Then came mesquite, thorned, bitter, resilient. Its pods were gathered and ground into flour, a protein-rich gift from a tree whose roots could reach deeper than a man's grave. To grow food in this landscape was to grow with the landscape, to know its moods, its unspoken rules. Seeds were not simply dropped into soil and forgotten. They were sung over, spoken to, carried in satchels of memory across generations. They grew in circles not of symmetry, but of wisdom, around boulders that cast protective shadows, near anthills that hinted at unseen moisture. What does it mean to farm without fields? But this was not agriculture as we know it. It was closer to tending than planting, to ritual than industry. They did not break the land with ploughs. They read its pulse and planted in its breath. The crops they raised were not rows in the soil, but relationships. Agave and yucca, cactus and mesquite, all coaxed into proximity with the homes carved from the earth nearby. If the desert had once seemed to conspire against human survival, it now participated in the effort. What kind of wisdom comes from eating the same root your ancestors tended under the same sun? What kind of memory is held in the callus of a hand shaped by the same stone tools, generation after generation? What happens when sustenance becomes a kind of worship? You begin to build differently, not just with materials, but with intent. Across the canyons and mesas of what is now the American Southwest, a new architectural language emerged. It did not aim to conquer the land with walls, but to collaborate with it through shadow, stone, and rhythm. Seasonal villages began to rise like mirages that knew when to appear and when to vanish. These were not permanent towns, but cyclical arrangements, places designed not for ownership, but for return. The people moved with the rains, and the rains moved through memory. In shaded alcoves and along rocky terraces, they constructed cisterns, stone-lined bowls to catch and hold the rare rains that danced briefly across the sky. Some were no larger than a family hearth, others expansive enough to support entire clans through dry months. These cisterns were not the start of sedentism, but of rooted flexibility, a deep acknowledgement that presence in the desert must remain humble. Stay too long, and the land forgets how to feed you. Stay away too long, and it forgets you entirely. Around these water-holding hollows grew something more than infrastructure. The spaces surrounding them became circles of instruction, of story, of silence. Elders taught not from podiums but from shadows, pointing to the angle of a stone, the lean of a tree, the timing of a bloom. Children learned not just how to find water, but how to recognize when it had passed by in the night. Cisterns, in this way, became more than containers. They were teachers, mirrors, monuments to patience. Alongside the cisterns, people laid homes into the landscape with astonishing subtlety. Dug partially into the earth, they used thermal inertia to remain cooler than the daytime heat and warmer than the chill of desert nights. Roofs were made not to be seen, but to disappear, blended with branches, clay and woven brush, so that from a distance it was as if the people had vanished into the land entirely. To a passing stranger, or a hunting eagle, there was nothing here but rock and heat. But to those who knew, this was abundance veiled in silence. They learned too how to live inside the clock of the land. Activity pulsed with temperature. Dawn and dusk became more than times of day. They were permissions. To move, to work, to breathe deeply. Midday was not for effort, but for retreat, for listening to the stones expand in the heat. Time became circular, not linear. Seasons did not simply follow one another, they wove into each other. A successful year wasn't marked by accumulation, but by balance. Not how much one gathered, but how little one needed to take. Here in the desert, architecture and agriculture, timing and stillness all began to merge. The land was no longer an enemy to be endured, but a wisdom to be followed. And in this shift, the people began to become something new. Not just survivors of the desert, but children of it. Not refugees from a better place, but inhabitants of the only world that had ever spoken their name. In time, this transformation of practice began to reflect a transformation of belief. Where once the desert had been feared, a punishing space, a consequence, a test, it now became a mentor. And like all good teachers, it did not explain itself. It waited. It offered patterns, not answers. It demanded humility more than faith. And in that quiet space, something deeply spiritual took root, not despite the scarcity, but because of it. There is a shift, a profound one, that occurs when a culture stops seeing nature as something to be endured or escaped, and begins to see it as sacred. The desert was no longer the backdrop to survival. It was survival itself, embodied. The heat, the dryness, the brilliance of the light and the cruelty of the droughts. These were not punishments. They were initiations. They were the long, slow education of a people learning to belong. So the stories began to change. No longer only about escaping heat or praying for rain, they evolved into songs about the wind's memory, the whisper of smoke, the shapes of hills that cradled the morning sun just right. These weren't fables. They were functional, mnemonic, technological. Spirituality did not separate from survival. It wove through it like the threads of a basket. Songs were not metaphors. They were blueprints, maps of when to dig, how to wait, where to stand when the sky darkens with summer clouds. Rituals formed around growth and restraint. The first blooming agave was not harvested, but watched, respected, sometimes sung to. Young gatherers were taught not to take what was easiest but what was oldest, or sometimes what had fallen. Gratitude was expressed not in words, but in restraint. The desert offered no forgiveness to those who rushed it, but it rewarded those who listened. It rewarded those who did less. In these societies, power did not belong to those who controlled the most, but to those who remembered the most. Elders were archives, and their wisdom was not in abstract ideas but in lived patterns of rain cycles, animal migrations, plant timings, the angle of shadows on stone. Authority was earned through observation. The best leader was often the best listener. And in a place where the wrong decision could cost your children their lives, memory became a kind of sacred currency. The land was hard, but not cruel, and in its hardness it gave something rare. A culture that did not see itself above the world, but inside it. No hierarchy of human over nature, no dream of escape or conquest. Instead, a long and unfolding partnership, with drought and fire and sand as equal participants. The desert was not tamed, it was trusted, and in return it taught the people not just how to live, but how to mean something while doing it. Among the most remarkable lessons absorbed by these early desert dwellers was that life, in its most enduring form, is collaborative. Survival was never solitary. Even the plants seemed to speak this truth. Mesquite trees, with their deep roots stretching toward forgotten aquifers, not only provided food in the form of pods ground into sweet, nutritious flour, but also shade, firewood, shelter for animals, and spiritual metaphors. Their presence marked places where life held on so tenaciously, so quietly, that entire camps might be centred around a single ancient tree. And then there was agave. To the untrained eye, just a spiny plant baking under the sun. But to those who knew, the desert's most generous ally. Roasted in earth ovens over slow fires, agave hearts became a life-sustaining food, rich in sugars and complex carbohydrates. The fibres could be woven into rope and sandals, the sharp leaf tips fashioned into needles. Even the stalks, towering and hollow, were used as musical instruments or message carriers. In agave, the desert gave not a single gift, but a dozen, all wrapped in thorns, all requiring patience. What's striking is not just the ingenuity with which these resources were used, but the reverence that shaped their use. There are no signs of reckless harvest, no piles of wasted plants. Instead, scattered across archaeological sites are the remains of slow-cooked meals, deliberate roasting pits, carefully patterned layouts, evidence of care, of cycles observed and honoured. Even the arrangement of roasting pits suggests rhythm, not constant use, but seasonal return. These weren't exploitations, they were relationships. Villages rose and fell like breathing, here for the spring bloom, gone by midsummer heat, returning when the monsoons brushed life back into the creosote and cactus. Migration was not always forced. Sometimes it was an agreement. We live here when it lives here, they seemed to say, and when it slept they moved on. This consent-based occupancy revealed a deep understanding. Permanence was not security. Adaptability was. And flexibility wasn't a compromise, it was the whole point. So spiritual life turned not around temples or idols, but around timing. The desert's teachings were etched in light and wind and sand. You had to be present to read them. Clouds became omens, not of judgment, but of invitation. Stones formed cairns, not as territory markers, but as reminders. This is where the spring sings if the winter is kind. Prayer was not an ask. It was a posture, a readiness, a willingness to learn from everything, even absence. They lived lightly, not because they feared death, but because they understood how much life asked in return for its gifts. To take too much was to insult the very balance that allowed their breath. So they walked softly, built with care, sang to the invisible rhythms of wind and heat, not out of desperation, but out of a profound agreement with the earth. We belong to each other, and neither of us must be broken for the other to survive. So they walked softly, built with care, sang to the invisible rhythms of wind and heat, not out of desperation, but out of a profound agreement with the earth. We belong to each other, and neither of us must be broken for the other to survive. In that mutual accord, a new kind of resilience took root, not the brute endurance of suffering, but the supple strength of alignment. These early desert societies did not merely resist collapse, they redefined what survival meant. It wasn't the absence of danger, but the presence of understanding, and that understanding lived in every choice. When to plant, when to wander, how to breathe during noonlight, how to be still when the vultures circled low. Water was no longer simply found, it was grown, coaxed from the slow roots of desert crops, called back into human life through sweat and ceremony. Some villages, clustered around stones that cast long shadows across the driest months, became semi-permanent, not because water was abundant, but because knowledge had made it possible to stay. Cisterns were dug not deep but wisely, positioned to catch rare flash floods. Canals were shallow, carved not with greed but with restraint. A single pool might serve a dozen purposes, and each was seen as sacred. This transformation was not only physical, it was mythic. The desert was no longer a place they crossed, it was who they were. Identity merged with landscape. Children grew up learning not just how to avoid heatstroke, but how to read the colour of a stone, the silence of a canyon, the curvature of tracks left by beetles in the dust. To exist was to observe, to survive was to interpret. Even time itself began to bend around the rituals of bloom and burn, rather than around the arbitrary counting of days. When archaeologists look back at these communities, They often describe them in the language of adaptation, environmental response, subsistence strategies, climatic resilience. But those are the cold terms of outsiders. What really happened here, over generations, was a kind of sacred education, a philosophy of coexistence, an ethical system born not from law, but from the whispered teachings of wind and thorn and shadow. They were not just surviving the desert, they were being refined by it, and that perhaps is what still speaks to us across the silence of 10,000 years. Not the technologies, remarkable though they were, not the tools or the routes or the structures, but the orientation, the deep embodied knowledge that there is no away from nature, that our options are not domination or extinction, but intimacy. We cannot overcome the earth, but we can learn to harmonize with it. And when we do, even the most brutal landscapes stop being enemies. They become mirrors. In those mirrors we see ourselves, not as we often imagine ourselves to be, triumphant and apart, but as we truly are, fragile, curious, brief, dependent on rhythms we did not invent, capable of beauty not through control, but through listening. And perhaps, if we remember, capable still of learning once more to live with fire and sand. The temperature rises slowly but inexorably like a tide that does not retreat. 120 degrees in the shade, 130 in the open. These are no longer outliers, no longer confined to the hushed archives of climate records. In Phoenix, in Death Valley, in Las Vegas, the numbers return each year like a curse remembered, and with them, a question begins to take form, not scientific, not political, but deeply human. Have we been here before? Look carefully, and the footprints are still visible, only now they are ours. Asphalt buckles where ancient caliche once cracked, reservoirs dry where once lakes fled the sun millennia ago, and beneath our cities, beneath our roads and power lines, the bones of those who faced this trial once before, who walked across the same sand, beneath the same indifferent sky. What did they see that we do not? The drought we call historic is not the first. Between 6,000 and 4,000 years ago, the desert reached a crescendo of cruelty. Rain vanished for decades. Settlements were left mid-meal, tools abandoned, footsteps turning toward the horizon with no promise on the other side. But they endured, not by force, not through conquest, but by learning what the desert demanded. Do we listen the same way? Where we build air conditioning, they built shadows. Where we divert rivers, they carved memory into stone. And where we mourn each heat wave as a surprise, they had already buried songs in dry lake beds, waiting for clouds that might never come. What happens when forgetting becomes more dangerous than the heat itself? The old ones did not have satellites or graphs. They had patterns, encoded in wind, in the blooming of creosote, in the angle of shadows cast by mountains at dusk. Their science was patience, their technology was attention, and their legacy is not fossilized in museums. It breathes, if we are quiet enough to hear it. So we must ask again, what have we forgotten? Perhaps it is not the knowledge itself that is lost, but the conditions that allowed us to receive it. The world has grown loud, machine hums, data streams, alerts that crowd out the stillness where observation once lived. The people of the desert did not invent ways to escape their world. They invented ways to merge with it. They learned to become listeners, to tune their survival to the land's quiet rhythms, rather than impose their own. Their survival was not miraculous. It was methodological. To watch the desert bloom after the faintest drizzle was not simply beauty. It was a signal. To witness the return of dragonflies after a long absence was not mere coincidence. It was data. Even now, modern hydrologists tracing ancient water paths often follow the same markers: clusters of insects, damp soil beneath a shale outcrop, or a single green reed defying a horizon of dust. In the Mojave, archaeologists have traced villages that flourished not near rivers, but near stone bowls carved over centuries by trickles of seasonal runoff. These were not oases by accident. They were cultivated by awareness. By people who knew that water doesn't only flow on the surface, and that time doesn't only move forward. Knowledge too flows, downward sometimes, and it pools in quiet places. But where does that knowledge go when the silence is gone? Today our deserts are full of warnings: flash floods without rain, wildfires without flame, air so dry it leaches moisture from lungs and eyes, and yet our cities sprawl farther into these arid lands than ever before, chasing comfort with concrete and copper wires. We do not ask the desert what it allows, we build as if it were not there. The prehistoric people of the Southwest could not afford such delusions. They did not control the climate, but they controlled their responses. When a lake dried, they moved. When a plant failed to bloom, they listened. When a trail grew too hot to walk in the sun, they walked at night. Their adaptability was not passive, it was crafted, shaped by the awareness that every footprint in the desert must be earned. We often see the ancient past as a time of constant fear and struggle. But what if that perception is just our own fear projected backward? What if, for them, the desert was not an enemy, but a profound teacher? One whose lessons were hard but not cruel, whose challenges were not punishments, but invitations to evolve. The climate is changing, yes, but climate has always changed. What differs now is how we've dulled our sensitivity to it. We measure everything except what matters most: humility. The desert peoples of prehistory did not require weather stations or satellites to know when a drought was coming. They listened to the creak of willow roots, watched the migration of birds, felt the coarseness of wind against the skin. Their science was not separate from the sacred. It was practiced in footsteps, in gestures, in breath, held when the sun rose 2 degrees too far north. It was a literacy of place. They didn't store knowledge in books. They carved it into stone, not as declarations, but as memory prompts. Spirals etched into canyon walls echoed seasonal cycles. Petroglyphs near springs depicted not gods, but instructions. A curve resembling a snake might have marked the path of a buried aquifer. A jagged line, the direction of the prevailing wind. These were not mere decorations. They were compasses for the soul, and now we are relearning to read them. Modern climate scientists have begun consulting with indigenous elders to understand long-term environmental patterns. Fire ecologists study traditional burn practices, not just to prevent disaster, but to foster regeneration. Even urban planners look to ancient village layouts to inspire passive cooling in modern architecture. In this return, something ancient stirs, not just knowledge, but reverence. It is this reverence we have lost. We seek mastery over nature, while those who came before us sought alignment. We build with the presumption of permanence. They built with the wisdom of impermanence. Their structures were light, movable, low to the ground, not because they lacked ambition, but because they understood scale. The desert could not be conquered, but it could be befriended. In our age, heat is framed as anomaly, drought as emergency. Yet in the deep past, both were expected teachers. The people did not pray for endless comfort. They danced for equilibrium. They asked not for escape, but for endurance. And in that endurance, they became something more than survivors. They became keepers of an intimacy with land we have mostly abandoned. Perhaps this is the most radical memory we can recover, that adaptation is not failure, that surrender is not weakness, that listening is not passivity, but power. To walk backward through this history is to feel heat on the skin, yes, but also to feel the touch of an ancient hand guiding yours towards shade. It is to walk with those who came before, and in doing so, remember that the future is not written in cement but in sand. And sand shifts. The desert is not dead. It is not empty. It is not waiting to be filled. It is alive with the slow heartbeat of stone and wind, with stories that rise only when you are silent enough to hear them. And now you are silent. Not with fear or confusion, but with respect. This is the return, not a retreat to the past, but a circling back with new eyes. You stand where they once stood, on the edge of heat, on the brink of thirst, and you see that their struggle was not a prelude to yours. It is yours. Consider the spiralling temperatures today. Phoenix recording weeks above 110 degrees. The Colorado River trickling into dust. Lake Mead revealing sunken boats and forgotten towns. These are not unprecedented tragedies. They are remembered conditions. They are echoes of the 6,000-year droughts that scattered the ancient villages, and they will come again. But those ancestors did not vanish. Their cultures endured, migrated, adapted, evolved. the descendants of those who walk the old salt flats now steward the land, carry songs that chart water, not just by geography but by memory. Some still gather agave in spring, still walk by starlight, still know the direction of damp wind at dawn. They know what we have forgotten, that resilience is a rhythm, not a reaction. In modern cities, we insulate ourselves from this rhythm. We chill our air, import our food, bury our water in pipes. But under pressure, the old knowledge surfaces. In the cracked sidewalk where mesquite grows without invitation, in the community garden where desert-adapted beans root deeper than concrete. In the power outage where neighbours gather under shade trees planted long ago by someone who thought not of today, but of tomorrow. So we ask again, can we remember in time? Can we, like those before us, shift from ownership to relationship? Can we build homes that breathe rather than blister, cities that bend with the wind instead of breaking against it? Can we learn, again, to move when it's too hot, to rest when the land rests, to speak only when the silence is ready to answer? The path forward may not be straight. It may be spiral, like the petroglyphs. It may require detours into old languages, into older ways of knowing, into humility not as loss but as rediscovery. But it is there. You've walked with them now. You've seen how 10,000 years of struggle etched patience into every tool, every fire pit, every footprint in the salt. You've seen the shape of survival not as a bunker but as an open hand. You've seen that the desert does not forget. Only we do. But memory is a muscle. It strengthens with use. And if we are to live in this changing world, this warming, hungering, sand-swept world, we must stretch that muscle. We must let memory return through story, through ritual, through attention. Because the future is not built from invention alone. It is built from what we choose to carry forward. And the desert offers us more than warning. It offers us a library. Each canyon wall is a page. Each hearth buried in dust is a paragraph. Each vanished spring is a footnote. And the people who survived it all, those who lived in balance with silence, with fire, with absence, left the knowledge not in words, but in practice. Perhaps this is what we must remember most, that survival is not a technology, it is a relationship. The prehistoric peoples of the American Southwest did not bend the land to their will. They listened to its rhythms and moved in kind. They grew food not in defiance of heat, but in dialogue with it. They made offerings not from superstition, but from gratitude, recognizing that scarcity did not erase wonder. In fact, it deepened it. There are signs now that this wisdom stirs again. In desert cities, architects design buildings that breathe like cacti, expanding and contracting with the sun. Farmers grow milpas between creosote and mesquite, harvesting not just food but shade. Children learn from elders how to track wind patterns, how to taste the air for the memory of rain. These are not reenactments, they are revivals. And what of you, the viewer, the listener, the traveller who began this journey in curiosity? You have returned across time, but you're not the same. You carry with you an older kind of sight, one that looks past the shimmer of heat and sees the intelligence hidden within. You understand now that resilience isn't an emergency measure. It's a philosophy, one born of patience, intimacy and reverence for place. So when the next summer rises like a wall, when the news speaks of record-breaking heat and dwindling reservoirs, you will not be surprised. And more importantly, you will not feel helpless, because now you know others have stood here before. They survived not by resisting the land, but by learning its grammar. They left you tools made of stone, of fibre, of silence. They left you stories, not as nostalgia, but as instruction. And the final question becomes your own. In an age of rising heat, will we remember in time? That answer begins not in policy, nor in panic, but in presence. In the quiet act of watching how shadows move across stone. In learning the names of forgotten springs. In walking at dusk where the ground still holds the warmth of 1,000 generations. The journey was never about escaping the desert. It was about understanding that we are already in it, and we always have been. And perhaps, if we remember what it means to belong to a place, rather than rule it, we might just learn to survive again. Not despite the heat, but because of it, Thank you, fellow Sapiens, for walking this long road through the drought-scorched echoes of the past, for tracing the faded steps of those who crossed deserts not just of sand, but of time. If this story helped you feel a deeper stillness, sparked a question about your place in the world, or simply brought the warmth of remembrance to your day, then thank you deeply for lending your presence. I wonder what moment from this journey lingers with you now. Was it a phrase, a footprint, a breath of wind against a firelit sky? Whether it was the image of petroglyphs marking water instead of gods, the quiet ritual of offerings to vanished clouds, or the enduring memory of rivers buried beneath our feet, these fragments become the bridge between memory and meaning, between solitude and shared story. If something stayed with you, I invite you to leave it in the comments, not as noise, but as a quiet offering, a way to build this circle of listeners who remember forward together. If you found light here, consider liking, subscribing, or sharing the story with someone else seeking orientation in the heat. We have more journeys ahead, of winds, myths, and maps not yet drawn. Until we meet again, stay curious, stay thoughtful,